Chapter 1. Patience Graham hummed her favorite hymn from church to herself as she walked toward the storeroom in her parents' restaurant. Graham's Grub wasn't the only restaurant in town, but it was quickly becoming a favorite among the locals. Despite her family's success, Patience was having some trouble adjusting to her new life in Creede, Colorado. For one thing, she was rather lonely. She had left her closest friends behind when the family had moved their business out west. For another, she was bored. Ever since a recent string of kidnappings, her parents had stricter rules for where she could and could not go by herself. It didn't seem fair, because the women who were kidnapped had been found, but her parents didn't feel right allowing her outside in a town where dangers lurked. There had been a few new kidnapping attempts, but they'd all been foiled. Surely people knew what to watch for by now. Patience pushed open the heavy door and waited until her eyes had adjusted to the dim light streaming from the sole window in the room. She wrinkled her nose as she took in the damp, dusty scent of the storeroom. The door fell shut behind her with a heavy thud. Once she could see clearly, she surveyed the small storage area until her eyes landed on what she was looking for: strawberry preserves. Patience had planned a special dessert for that evening's dinner menu, and she needed the preserves for it to turn out perfectly. Patience gathered the jars and went back toward the door. She leaned back as she grabbed the handle of the old wooden door to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. Patience stopped humming and frowned. She set the jars down on one of the nearby shelves and used both hands to pull the door open. The door remained closed. Patience took a deep breath and tried again, this time propelling all of her body weight against the door. She was a small woman, but she was also quite strong when it came right down to it. Still, the door refused to budge even an inch. A panicky feeling settled in her chest. She began knocking on the door and crying out, "Please help. Can anyone hear me?" Patience screamed as loudly as she could. She knew her mother and father were likely in the kitchen, and although the Grahams employed a few men and women, they did not usually have cause to be in the vicinity of the storeroom. This had never happened to her before, and she wasn't sure what to do. She had light from the tiny window, but that would fade in a few short hours. She wouldn't go hungry. The storeroom shelves were filled with plenty of food and water, but she would certainly go mad if she were locked in the storeroom any longer than she had to be. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, so they wouldn't even know where to look for her. Patience looked around the small space, trying to figure out if she'd be able to climb the storeroom walls and shimmy out the small window. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. You'll fall and hurt yourself." A voice seemingly out of nowhere startled Patience so much that she nearly fell over. She looked behind her, where the sound had come from. A woman with flowing, wavy dark hair was standing right next to her. Patience blinked rapidly. "How did you get in here?" "The door's stuck." "Don't worry about how I got in here. What matters is that I'm here now, and I have something to tell you, Patience." The woman beamed, and a peaceful sensation flowed over Patience. Patience found it difficult to understand. "How do you know my name? Who are you?" "You may not know me, Patience, but I know you very well. Please, hear me out." The woman's expression turned serious, and Patience knew she had better pay attention. "Fine. Go ahead." Perhaps she had already gone mad from being in the dark storeroom too long. She was seeing things. Patience tried to ignore this thought so she could concentrate on the woman's words. The woman spoke quickly but confidently. Patience believed every word she said. "Very soon, you will be tested, Patience. You're going to meet a man who is in dire need of acceptance. It's important that you open your heart to him." Although Patience trusted the mysterious stranger, she wondered how that could possibly be true. "I'm never allowed to meet anyone new. Trust me, Patience. It's going to happen sooner than you may think. And if you don't open your heart, I'm afraid there will be grave consequences." The woman hung her head sadly, and Patience felt like reaching out to comfort her. "What kind of consequences?" Patience asked out loud. Before she could get an answer, the woman had vanished, just as quickly as she had appeared. Patience looked all over the small room. How was that possible? A mysterious woman she had never met had somehow managed to find a way into and out of a storeroom with a locked door, and Patience hadn't even seen her coming or going. It didn't make any sense. She wondered if she'd accidentally hit her head or dreamed up the strange woman. Before she could puzzle over this for too long, Patience's thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock on the door. "Is anyone in there?" "It's the strangest thing," a deep, male voice asked. "Why, yes," Patience stammered. Was she being rescued? Or was this another trick of her imagination? "Hold on a second. I've got to get my tools." Patience heard footsteps walk away. Her heart fell as she waited for them to return. What if he never came back? Would anyone have any idea where she was? And how long would it take before her parents panicked and sent out a search party? Fortunately, the footsteps soon returned, and within a few minutes and several squeaking noises, the storeroom door swung open. "Thank you," Patience cried, rushing out into the narrow corridor. "Oh, I feel like I can breathe again. The air in there is so musty." "Patience. How long were you in there?" the deep voice continued, and Patience looked up into the eyes of her rescuer. It was none other than John Jackson, one of the most handsome young men in town. Patience and John had spoken to one another when the Grahams first arrived in town, but they hadn't exchanged more than a few words since then. Once, she had hoped he'd ask permission to court her, but she had given up that notion when he seemed to completely ignore her at church or when he made his deliveries to Graham's Grub. John Jackson felt a thrill at seeing Patience Graham again. She was even prettier up close, even if she was a little dusty. He was used to seeing her at a distance in church, where he admired her lovely singing voice and pretty dresses. This was much better. He wondered what she'd look like without her bouncy skirt, and then he adjusted his eyes to meet her gaze, scolding himself for his improper thoughts. Patience Graham was a good woman, and a scoundrel like him didn't deserve her. True, he'd been working hard the past few months to stay away from drink. He had given up his vice of choice after his widowed father had remarried Toria. His stepmother was so energetic and full of love and life that she had inspired him to live a clean, wholesome life. He wanted to be the type of man who was deserving of Patience's affections, but he didn't know if he was there yet. "John. You saved me. How did you know I was here?" Patience gushed. She was grateful for the opportunity to have a conversation with someone outside her family or the people who worked at Graham's Grub. It was a rare occurrence. "I was about to make a delivery, I've got the wagon outside, and it was the weirdest thing. I heard a voice that seemed like it was in my ear. It said, 'Go to the storeroom. You'll find what you're looking for,'" John explained, a bewildered expression on his face. Patience felt chills run down her spine. She felt like she and John had both had very strange encounters in the past few minutes. She didn't feel comfortable enough to tell him about it. She was worried he'd think she was crazy. "That is strange. But I'm so glad that happened because you found me." "I'm glad about that, too." John grinned down at her, and Patience felt her heart skip a beat as his amused eyes met her own. Patience knew she didn't have long before John would have to continue on his delivery route. She decided to be blunt. "I haven't seen you very much lately." "That disappoints me greatly." John's face fell. He had never imagined that she would be upset not seeing him. He knew how he felt about her, but he thought there was no way a woman like her would want to spend time with a man like him. Then again, John thought, she was probably just saying that because she wanted to make sure he was making good decisions and staying on the right path. That was the only possible explanation. "I've been busy with work, I suppose." John worked for his father, Mortimer Jackson, at the Creed Mercantile. He made deliveries with his assistant, a young boy named Willie who had lost his father in a terrible accident. Willie and John were both hard workers, and they were a great team. Between working long days making deliveries all over the town of Creed, going to church, and nightly dinners with his father and stepmother, John really didn't have much time to socialize. "Well, that's a shame. I wish I were able to see more of you. Still, I know the work that you do is important. It's the only way we're able to get the supplies we need to stay in business." Patience really was grateful for John's family business. she wasn't saying these things to flatter him. It was true. In a booming town like Creede, the Grahams needed to stay competitive with the other restaurants, and they did so by ordering ingredients from far-off places that only the mercantile could locate and deliver. I think you stay in business because of your mother's lemon chiffon cake. With all due respect, John said, tipping his hat. You haven't had my strawberry pie yet. Patience smiled. She just knew John would fall in love with her strawberry pie. Are you offering me a slice? Going through my route does make me tired and hungry. John patted his trim stomach. If you can come back here this evening, after the rest of your deliveries, I'll save you a slice. On account of you saving me and all, Patience promised. Really? I wouldn't want to trouble you. John looked hopeful, like he wanted the pie badly, but he was afraid to say so. I insist. Now, I think we both need to get back to work. Patience grinned as she walked away from the storeroom and toward the restaurant's kitchen. John watched Patience walk away and knew that he had to find a way to convince her to be with him. Other men his age in town were getting married and starting families, and he hadn't given it much thought since his mother had died. Though he knew it's what she would have wanted for him, he'd had a tough time after her death. All he wanted to do was drink and spend time in the saloon with his friends. He had been in a very bad way, but Toria Jackson had turned him around. She had truly been a blessing, sent from God into his and his father's lives, to make them happy and whole again. He had worked hard to avoid alcohol and saloons, and now maybe it was time to start thinking about settling down. One thing was certain, Patience Graham was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and she was kind and thoughtful, too. If he were going to settle down with anyone, she was the perfect woman to settle down with. That evening, John all but inhaled his dinner at the Jackson house. Slow down, you'll get hiccups. Toria Jackson laughed. She was secretly pleased that he enjoyed her food so much. And remember, I have cookies and lemon bars for dessert. You truly are a wonder. Mortimer's eyes gleamed with pride and love as he looked at his wife. Toria waved him off. You know I can't stay idle. And I happen to enjoy keeping you men from being hungry. Thank you very much, Toria. I won't be staying for dessert, though. John explained, wiping his mouth with his handkerchief. Toria and Mortimer exchanged a look. Why not? Toria asked. I need to meet someone and get something that was promised to me. John didn't want to go into too much detail. He knew his parents would make more of a fuss than was necessary. At this hour? Toria raised an eyebrow. Mortimer thought back to the days when John visited the saloon nearly every night. He had thought those days were over. John sighed. Fine. If you must know, I'm meeting Patience Graham. She promised me a slice of her strawberry pie because I helped her get out of a storeroom she was locked inside earlier today. Toria tried to hide her smile. She had prayed for John to find a good woman in town, and Patience was certainly one of them. Though Toria didn't know the Grahams very well, she was impressed by the modest, kind way Patience presented herself at church. She would be thrilled to have Patience as a daughter-in-law one day. I'm sorry I have to leave early. John blushed a little as he stood up. It's all right. Patience is lucky to have a friend like you, John, Toria said, beaming with pride. Although she hadn't raised John, she felt proud of the work he'd done over the past several months to avoid alcohol and live an honest life. Hopefully, soon she'll be more than a friend. He didn't dare say this out loud in front of his parents. They were both very old-fashioned and wouldn't approve of improper thoughts about a single young woman. John smiled and thought of Patience's lovely figure as he walked out of the front entrance to the house. He unhitched his horses from their post, nuzzling their heads and slipping them pieces of one of Toria's famous cookies he had snuck into his pocket as a snack. He climbed into his delivery wagon and set off for the other side of town. When he arrived at Graham's Grub, there were several other wagons parked outside, and a crowd of people had gathered outside of the building, talking and laughing. He parked in the usual spot he used for his deliveries, because he knew no one would need it at this time of night. The crowd began to break up, men and women walked back to their wagons or set off on foot for their homes. John tied his horses to a post and strode into the restaurant. It was dark inside, but there were candles lit on each table, and there was a blazing fireplace in the corner of the great room. Mrs. Graham, who John recognized from church, walked up to him. "Hello, John. Are you dining alone this evening, or will anyone be joining you?" "Dining alone, ma'am." John tipped his hat to Mrs. Graham to demonstrate respect. He wasn't sure why, but he wanted to make a good impression on her. "And I've already eaten a meal. I'm just here for dessert." "That's just fine, dear. Let me find you a table." Mrs. Graham led John toward the back of the room, a seat right next to the fireplace. She smiled at him. "Someone will be right with you." John enjoyed the heat from the roaring fire. Some tables were occupied, but most people seemed to be near the end of their meal. After a few minutes, Patience rushed over to John's table, her cheeks flushed pink. "Hello, John." "Hello, Patience. I'm glad to see you haven't gotten yourself stuck in another storeroom." John grinned. She was cute when she blushed. Heck, she was cute all of the time. "Yes, I've managed to keep myself out of trouble this afternoon. I have to admit, though, it wasn't so bad because it meant I got to see you." Patience blushed an even deeper shade of pink. She didn't know why she had said that. She tried to change the subject. "Are you ready for that pie?" "Absolutely. I've been looking forward to it, but more importantly, seeing you, all day," John admitted. He knew he wasn't going to impress Patience with how open he was being, but he couldn't help himself. "I'll be right back." Patience scurried away before she could embarrass herself further. John was a smooth talker, but she surely couldn't trust a word he said. He had a reputation for being a drinker, and though he went to church each Sunday, Patience had a feeling that the drinking part wouldn't go over too well with her parents. The Grahams had long taught Patience, their only child, that she needed to be selective and picky when it came to men. They believed she would have her choice of men when the time came due to her beauty, intellect, and grace. Patience was trying to live up to her namesake and not rush into any romantic entanglements. Patience walked into the kitchen and found the slice of strawberry pie she had tucked away earlier, for John. The cakes and pies often sold out, and she had wanted to make sure she could fulfill her promise to him. It was the least she could do after he had saved her from being trapped in the storeroom for hours. As Patience thought about her time in the storeroom, she remembered the strange woman she had seen there. It seemed completely impossible for the woman to have been there with her, but she had seen the woman, plain as day. Patience sighed and shook her head, trying to clear her mind. She put the slice of pie on a small white plate and carried it out to John. "Here you go." Patience set the plate in front of him. John could feel his mouth start watering. "Thank you kindly." "It's my pleasure. Is there anything else you need?" Patience fidgeted, clasping her hands in front of her. "I don't need anything, but I'd like for you to stay here while I take my first bite." John smiled, and Patience saw a mischievous gleam in his eye. Patience looked around. Her mother and father were in the kitchen. She hoped no one would see her lingering at John's table and accuse her of neglecting responsibility. "Fine. But you'd better hurry." "I'll try. But if it's really good, I plan to take my time with it and savor it." John hoped he wasn't being too forward. He picked up his fork from the table and stuck it into the pie. He put the fork into his mouth and chewed slowly, enjoying the sweet tang of strawberry on his tongue. The pie was a perfect blend of savory and sweet. The crust was soft and buttery, and the strawberry was light and tart. John sighed. Patience's heart rate quickened as she saw how much John enjoyed her pie. "Patience Graham, I swear to you, I could eat that pie every day for the rest of my life." John looked into her eyes, and Patience knew he was telling the truth. "Patience. They're waiting for you at the table in the front. You know we don't have enough staff to cover every table, and we need you to help out." Patience's father, Robert Graham, approached the table and looked at Patience sternly. He turned his gaze to John. "How are you enjoying your dessert, young man?" "It's positively heavenly, Mr. Graham. You know, we sure do appreciate having your restaurant in Creed. Ever since you've come here, Graham's Grub has become my favorite restaurant in the entire town." John hoped his words would not come off as insincere. He meant every bit of what he said. The Grahams made amazing food, and it was clear that Patience had inherited the family skill. Mr. Graham looked back and forth between John and his daughter. He knew John's father, and Mortimer Jackson was a good, fair, and honest man. But all he knew about John was that he favored alcohol. He knew his daughter had enough sense not to flirt with a man of disrepute, but he saw the way John had admired his daughter, and he was more than a little concerned. He tried to brush aside his worry. "Patience, you go now to the table in the front. I'll take care of Mr. Jackson." Patience looked disappointed but did what her father asked of her. "Have a good night," she whispered to John as she walked toward the table in the front of the restaurant. John tipped his hat to her as she walked away. He admired how gracefully she carried herself and how sure and confident her movements were. He ate more forkfuls of the pie, wishing she had saved him another slice. He had meant exactly what he said about eating that same pie each day for the rest of his life. Both John and his father had a soft spot for sweets, and Toria kept them well stocked in the Jackson household, but Patience's strawberry pie was unlike anything John had tasted before. As he polished off his last piece of pie, John noticed that Mr. Graham was still staring at him anxiously. He looked up at Mr. Graham, and the older man looked guilty, like John had caught him doing something wrong. "Do you need anything else?" Mr. Graham asked in a rush. "No, thank you. I have everything I need." John wiped his mouth with the linen napkin from the table. "Fine. I'll mark this in the ledger, and you can settle up next time you come and make one of your deliveries," Mr. Graham told him. Just then, Patience flew in from the other side of the room. "Oh, that won't be necessary, Father. I invited Mr. Jackson here to try my dessert because he helped me earlier today." A look of concern flashed across Mr. Graham's face. "He did?" "Yes. I got locked in the storeroom. Did you know the door sticks? And John found me and found a way to open it." Patience looked at John with gratitude. Mr. Graham frowned. "You should have told me. I'll take a look at that door." "You have my thanks, young man." John didn't think Mr. Graham's expression looked very thankful, but he would take what he could get. He hoped that, in time, he could prove to the Graham family that he was a responsible, hard-working young man. Chapter 2. The following day, John Jackson was all Patience Graham could think about. She bustled about the restaurant, attending to different chores and tasks, but her mind was on the handsome man who had helped her the day before. Even though he had flirted with her the evening before, he didn't seem like the type who would be interested in settling down. Patience had always longed for a husband and a house full of babies. She was worried that if she waited too long, that might never happen. She tried to think of someone else. Surely there was another young man in Creed who was more suitable, but her thoughts kept returning to John and John alone. Meanwhile, on his delivery route, John Jackson fantasized about taking Patience Graham out on a proper date. He didn't know how he would convince her father, or her, for that matter, that he was responsible enough to do so, but he knew that was what he wanted. He was so distracted that he made a wrong turn on the way to one of their usual delivery spots, and Willie, the young boy who assisted him on his route, had to point it out to him. "What did you do that for, John?" Willie cried. "We're going to be late for Mrs. Franklin." Mrs. Franklin was the kind woman who ran one of the many boarding houses in Creed. John was grateful there were good women like her in the town. He enjoyed his life there, but it had more than its fair share of problems. Greedy individuals came to Creed attempting to find wealth and fortune and ended up working grueling hours in the mines. Too many men turned to drink or women for comfort. That would have been bad enough, but there was also a corrupt sheriff, a crooked businessman, and the businessman's cruel nephew, Archibald Grady. Archie had arranged for several women to be kidnapped, but he remained free from jail because of his connections. He had been arrested and then released, with the former sheriff claiming that he didn't have enough evidence that Archie committed the crime. John was relieved that the women had been found alive, but he worried about something like that happening to Patience. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if anything happened to her. Even though he wasn't her husband, he felt a sense of responsibility for protecting her and keeping her safe. "Come on, John. We're here," Willie pointed out, hopping out of the buggy while John just sat there, staring at something. Willie waited for John to step down and unload packages from the back of the wagon. John handed the packages to Willie, and Willie ran to the front door of the boarding house. He knocked on the door. A young woman answered the door with a baby in her arms. Willie recognized her as Becky Bowen, a young woman who had found herself in a precarious position after her fiancé had died just a week before her wedding. She and her fiancé had anticipated their vows, and she had ended up pregnant and alone, staying with Mrs. Franklin. Fortunately, Amos Bowen had been boarding with Mrs. Franklin and was taken with the beautiful woman. He hadn't judged her for her mistake and instead had proposed to her on the day they'd met. Now, they lived just outside of town in a big house Amos had built. "Hi, Willie," Becky said softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping baby. "I'm just here visiting Mrs. Franklin. What have you got for her today?" Willie was quiet, too. "There are 2 packages. Where would you like me to put them?" Becky opened the door a bit wider. "You can set them right here on this table." Willie came inside and set the packages down. "Goodbye, Becky." "Bye, Willie," Becky whispered. She watched him walk out the door and back to the wagon, and she waved at John Jackson. She was impressed. John looked much nicer than he usually did. She liked his father, Mortimer, a great deal, but all she knew about John was that he had taken up drinking after his mother's death. He was a handsome man, but she had often seen him look sloppy and unkempt. Today, his hair was combed neatly, and he was wearing a crisp white shirt and pants. John waved back at Becky. She was a kind woman, and he was grateful things had worked out for her and Amos. Life would be hard for an unwed mother anywhere, but it would have been especially terrible in Creed, where women seemed to be in constant danger. If Becky had gotten a second chance, John mused, maybe he could, too. "John. Are you even listening to me?" Willie complained. "We are going to be late again." He didn't understand why his boss was so distracted. Willie and John were normally a great team, getting done with all of their scheduled deliveries by the end of the day. Sometimes, they even had time to stop by the mercantile, and Toria would sneak a few cookies or loaves of bread to Willie that he could share with his family. Since Willie's father's accident, his mother had struggled to keep food on the table for her 5 children. Luckily, she had fallen in love with a doctor who had come to serve the people of Creed, J.T. Thomas. Before his mother had remarried, Toria and Mortimer had provided a little extra food for the family. Now that generosity was no longer needed, but Willie still liked the treats Toria continued to offer him. He didn't eat as many as Mortimer and John did, but he liked them just the same. "I'm sorry, Willie. I guess I am a little distracted. I'm thinking about a lovely young woman." "I think I have feelings for her," John admitted. "That's gross. I don't want to hear about it." Willie put his hands over his ears, and John chuckled. Willie was too young to understand what it felt like to be in love. The thought startled John. Was he really in love with Patience Graham? "What's our next stop?" John asked Willie, wanting to think about something else for a change. "Graham's Grub," Willie replied. John groaned. "What's wrong with the restaurant?" "They make good food, and sometimes, Patience gives me a biscuit if they have extra." Willie was puzzled. "I was there yesterday. I was hoping to have a little break." John didn't want to tell Willie that Patience was the young woman on his mind. Word got around town fast, and he didn't want to tell Willie something the young boy might repeat. "Well, we should get going, if you want us to make it there before the end of the day." Willie grumbled. He didn't know what had gotten into his boss, but he didn't like it. He enjoyed having a job and the responsibilities that came along with it. He did not enjoy being late. "You're right, Willie." John laughed, and they set off for the restaurant. When they arrived, John parked in his usual spot. Willie hopped out, but John held up a hand. "Actually, Willie, I'd like to make this delivery myself." But then I definitely won't get a biscuit. Willie pouted. I'll be quick. I promise. John picked up the package that was addressed to Robert Graham and went to the front door of the restaurant. It was morning, too early for the restaurant to be open for lunch, so he knocked on the door. To his relief, Patience was the one who opened the door. Surprise danced across her pretty face. John. You're back again so soon? You fed me that strawberry pie. That was a mistake, because now I'm going to be chasing after that for the rest of my life. John smiled. She was even lovelier in person than she was in his mind when he was thinking about her. He held out the package. This here is addressed to your father. Thank you, I'll take it to him. Patience took the package from John and paused, as if she wanted to say something else. Then she bit her lip. Thank you, John. You're welcome, Patience. You know, after last night, I was thinking. What are the chances I could take you out one night? We could go to the ice cream parlor or one of the other restaurants in town, if that wouldn't count as betraying your parents. Shock flooded over Patience's face. John immediately felt like he had made a mistake. She looked down at the ground for a while, and then looked back up at John. I feel I would need to get to know you better before I would feel comfortable with that. I also think my father might have something to say on the matter. John nodded slowly. I understand completely. I should get going. Goodbye, John. Patience watched John walk away, his shoulders slumped and sagging. She felt awful for disappointing John. She had been taken aback by his question. She also hoped that as an only child himself, he could understand her perspective. Her parents were overprotective of her, and for good reason. She was their only child. Still, she had wanted badly to accept his offer. A real date with John Jackson. If he was asking to take her out on a proper date, did that mean that he truly cared for her? She had thought he just wanted to have a little fun, but if that were true, he could go to one of the saloons and find a woman to spend time with. She hoped she hadn't scared him away with her rejection. Patience took the package back to the kitchen, where both of her parents were preparing lunch. Package for you, Father. She brought it over to him, and he smiled. Thank you, dear. Robert opened the package and began unloading its contents. There were jars and jars of exotic spices, and they didn't all fit onto the crowded kitchen shelves. I'm going to take the rest of these into the storeroom. Patience sat down at the table in the kitchen her parents used to prepare food on. She loved to watch her mother prepare for lunch. Patience enjoyed cooking, but baking was her specialty. Her mother, on the other hand, was excellent at everything she set out to make. There were some men in Creed who dined there every single night. That was how much they loved her mother's cooking. She hoped John would become a regular like that. Then she could see him every day. Penny for your thoughts, dear? Patience's mother's gentle voice interrupted her daughter's daydreams. She was peeling potatoes and putting them into a pot to boil. Oh, it's nothing. Patience wasn't sure if she could tell her mother about the feelings she'd been having. Patience. You do know you can talk to me about anything, right? It's okay if you don't want to. But if you want to, I'm here. I was your age, too, once, remember? Lydia Graham smiled. She knew mothers and daughters didn't always get along, but she and her daughter had always had a special kinship. It was more like a friendship than a traditional mother-daughter relationship. Patience thought about it. It would feel good to open up to someone. Thank you, Mother. I was thinking about John Jackson. The young man from church who does deliveries? The one who was here last night for strawberry pie? Lydia began to piece together what was going on. Yes, that's the one. Patience couldn't help but smile as she thought about him and his broad shoulders and silly grin. Oh, my. I've never seen you this way about a young man before. Lydia sighed. Her daughter really was growing up. I've never felt this way about a young man before, Patience admitted. You know, he seems perfectly nice, but I don't know John or his family very well. I know his father from the mercantile, of course, but I would feel more comfortable asking some of my friends from church what they know about him. Lydia was already planning ahead for what might happen down the road: courtship, marriage, grandchildren. She was hopeful for her daughter, but also cautious. She had heard more than a few stories about the wild and unscrupulous men of Creed, and she wanted to make sure John was not one of them. "Mother, please don't make such a fuss about this." Patience knew she had made a mistake confiding in her mother. She didn't want the entire town to know about her feelings. "I won't make a fuss. My friends are very discreet." Lydia seemed offended. Patience had to laugh. She loved her mother, but Lydia and her friends were everything except discreet. When one of their daughters was getting married or having a baby, the entire town knew within a day. News of her feelings for John would surely spread throughout all of Creed in a matter of hours. "Please, Mother. Don't say anything." "I won't mention your name," Lydia promised. Patience sighed. She wished she had a sister or brother to share the burden of her parents with. She knew they loved her and wanted what was best for her, but sometimes, being an only child was truly exhausting. "Mother, I have a feeling you are going to ask your friends no matter what I say." "Darling, you know I only want what's best for you," Lydia protested. "Yes, Mother. I do know that." Patience didn't want to argue anymore. She was already exhausted. "Cheer up, Patience. You don't want your face to get stuck in a permanent frown, do you?" Lydia smiled warmly at her only daughter. She hoped there was an upstanding young man in Creed who would make a good husband for her daughter. Patience was truly special, and she wasn't going to stand idly by while some ordinary man tried to win her affections. Patience was young and inexperienced. Lydia considered it her duty as a mother to guide her toward the right husband. The problem was, she wasn't sure who exactly that was or if he lived in Creed. Patience turned the corners of her mouth up ever so slightly and stood up. "You're right, Mother." "Right about what?" Robert asked, coming back into the kitchen. "Nothing, dear." Lydia and Patience exchanged a secret grin. As overprotective as Lydia was, Robert was at least 10 times worse. Patience shuddered as she imagined Robert finding out about her feelings for John. She was actually a bit concerned at the lengths her father would go to if he didn't think John was a worthy candidate for her love. She was glad that her mother at least had the good sense not to say anything about John in front of her father. Robert trusted his wife enough not to ask for further information. He decided to change the subject. "What's on the menu tonight?" "Roast chicken with sautéed spinach and mushrooms," Lydia replied. "Wonderful. And what about dessert?" Robert asked, looking at Patience. "Chocolate custard, Father," Patience said dutifully. Robert walked over and kissed Patience on the forehead. "You're wonderful, sweetheart, do you know that?" Patience blushed. "Yes, Father." Robert put his arm around his daughter. "There's no way we would be able to keep going without your hard work and all that you do around here. When I see some of the other young people in this town, it makes me grateful to have you as my daughter." "Thank you, Father. You and Mother taught me the importance of family and respecting your parents. I'm thankful to you too for making sure I learned the value of hard work and discipline. I'm glad I didn't grow up in Creed, but I'm glad we live here now. There's so much good that can be done here." Patience felt like she had gotten a little carried away, but it was true. Creed seemed to attract a very specific type of person, and if anything went wrong, it seemed like terrible things started to happen. But there was a small group of people who were banding together to fight the darkness and corruption in power, and Patience was proud that she and her family were part of it. "Well said, my dear," Robert said as he walked over to a small desk in the corner where he kept his ledger. It was time to work on the daily accounts. "I need to get some cocoa for the custard." Patience excused herself. As she walked the narrow hallway toward the storeroom, she thought about John Jackson and what he might be doing that very moment. She thought he'd still be out on the delivery truck, making stops and helping carry the heavier boxes. She opened the door to the storeroom and found a large, heavy crate to prop the door open while she was inside. She didn't want the same thing that had happened the day before to occur again. As she walked back inside the dim storeroom, she was shocked to find a woman standing in front of her. "Oh, honey." The woman clucked her tongue. Patience realized with a start that it was the same dark-haired woman as yesterday. "There are things you don't understand yet about your parents and their beliefs." Patience blinked in confusion. "How do you know that? Are you friends with my parents?" The woman shook her head, seemingly impatient with all of Patience's questions. "We don't have time for that. I just needed to tell you that you are going to have to go against your parents' wishes very soon. You need to do it, Patience. Your future depends on it." Patience was frustrated. Who was this woman, and why was she telling her what to do? "I don't even know what that means. And I know my parents can overdo it a little because they want to protect me, but I respect their opinions, and I intend to obey their rules while I live in their house. With all due respect, I don't even know who you are. I can't help you if you won't help yourself." The woman shook her head sadly. "Just remember what I said." "Patience. Did you get lost?" a voice called out. Patience looked around the storeroom. The strange woman had vanished, and now someone was crying her name. Patience wondered for the second time in as many days if she was losing her mind. She quickly found the tin of cocoa powder, removed the crate propping open the storeroom door, and shut the door to the room. Patience hurried down the hallway, tin in her hand. "Yes?" "Just wanted to make sure you weren't daydreaming about a certain young man." Lydia eyed her daughter sternly as she bounded into the kitchen. "No, ma'am." Patience tried to catch her breath. She wanted to tell her mother what she'd really been doing, but she was afraid her mother would say she needed to take a trip to the local mental institution. She stood there for a moment, lost in her thoughts. "Patience. That custard isn't going to make itself," Lydia warned. "Yes, Mother." Patience snapped to attention. She would have to figure out who the mysterious woman was after she had finished her duties at the restaurant. All afternoon, the question troubled her. The woman had said that soon she would need to disobey her parents, but why? And what would the consequences be? Chapter 3. "You know, Nora Thomas looks very well recently. Marriage to Dr. Thomas has done her a world of good." Hannah Wheeler twirled her needle through the cross-stitch she was sewing. "Oh, yes. And good for the children as well." Millie Bing, the Reverend Callum Bing's sister, added. Lydia Graham didn't like to gossip, but she had to ask her women's sewing group if they had any information on the young man her daughter had seemed so taken by. She prayed it was simply a passing phase. She knew Patience was getting toward the marrying age, but she wasn't ready to lose her only daughter to a husband and a family of her own. Lydia bit her lip nervously. The Grahams were still fairly new to Creed, and she did not want to offend anyone or make an etiquette mistake. "I've seen her son, Willie, when he delivers packages to the restaurant. With John Jackson." "Willie's a dear," Beatrice Jameson said, rocking her daughter, Sally, on her shoulder. "John seems like a nice young man," Lydia said tentatively. She looked around the room, trying to read the other women's faces. According to Millie, just the simple fact of a group of women gathering was rather remarkable. With all of the violence and danger in Creed, many men did not allow their wives or daughters to go anywhere unaccompanied. Lately, though, many of the women had begun to work together to help improve the town, and no one could object to their hard work and dedication, as long as they were careful, of course. They met in the church in Bachelor, where Millie's brother presided. Millie coughed. Beatrice looked down. Lydia set her needlepoint down. "Oh, come on, ladies." "What is it?" "It's not that bad," Hannah reassured Lydia. "He's just known to be a bit of a drinker. Going to saloons, staying out all night, staggering back home. He is very sweet, though," Beatrice said. She was a true sweetheart and found it difficult to speak ill of anyone. "He suffered a lot when his mother passed." "Yes, but who knows what's going on in those saloons?" Hannah asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let me put it this way. If I had a daughter, I'd keep her away from John Jackson," Millie explained. Lydia hid her surprise. She had probably heard a rumor or two about John Jackson's drinking, but she had never had a reason to take them seriously until now. Well, that's good to know. I hope he finds his way to the right path. I agree, said Beatrice with a smile. Lydia wondered how strong her daughter's feelings were for John Jackson and how hard it would be to stop them. She was now certain, more than ever, that she needed to put a stop to this nonsense. John Jackson whistled as he drove his wagon toward Graham's Grub. He had dropped Willie off for the day after making all but one of their deliveries. He had just one more stop to make. John parked the wagon outside in his usual spot, picked up the small package from the back, and strode toward the front door. He knocked on it and waited for someone to answer. He hoped it would be Patience. Robert Graham opened the door, and his face twisted into a mix of anger and irritation. Mr. Jackson, what are you doing here? John didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He held up the item he was carrying. I have a delivery for Patience, sir. Is she here? I'd like to say hello. Robert grabbed the package out of John's hand and regarded it suspiciously. Fine. John expected Robert to open the door further and let him in, but instead, the older man slammed the door in the younger man's face. John took a step back. He was surprised at the old man's sudden violent streak. He shrugged. He would have to make it a point to talk to her at church or on his next delivery run. He was disappointed to miss her, but he hoped she would appreciate what he had found for her, a hymn book wrapped in a tiny, delicate green ribbon. The mercantile received regular shipments of books, and as soon as John saw it, he knew it would be perfect for Patience. He knew that she loved to sing and that she was very talented at it, so he thought she might enjoy a special book of her own to take with her to and from church, or anywhere else she might want to carry it. John chuckled to himself as he thought about the previous day when he'd found her stuck in that storeroom all alone. What was it about the woman that just made John want to protect her so badly? From her bedroom window in the Graham's living quarters, which were just the second floor of Graham's Grub, Patience watched John walk away. She wished she could call out to him or communicate with him in some way. Her mother had returned from her sewing group with a fervor about Patience not being able to have anything to do with John, including talking to him or going to the door when he brought deliveries. Worse, she had even told Patience's father the stories she'd heard about John's drinking. Now, Robert was pacing the length of the first floor, ranting about irresponsible young men. Patience knew better than to interrupt her father when he was in one of his moods, but she had overheard John giving her father a package for her. She thought that was odd because she hadn't ordered anything for herself or the restaurant. Usually, if she needed anything, she would either get it from her mother or make a trip to the mercantile. Her parents were the ones who ordered delivery goods. She wondered what could possibly be inside. At the Jackson house, John trudged through the door, hands shoved in his pockets. Toria looked up from the beef stew she was stirring on the stovetop, her apron pooched out far by the baby she carried. Is something wrong? You seem a little down. It's probably nothing, but I just made a delivery to Graham's Grub. I was hoping to see Patience so I could give her the book I bought her as a gift. Her father wouldn't let me see her. In fact, he slammed the door in my face. Toria could tell from the way her stepson was recounting the story that he was very upset by what had happened. I'm sorry that happened to you, John. That's strange, isn't it, Mortimer? Mortimer was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and he looked up when he heard his name. What's that, dear? Toria continued to stir the thick stew. John could smell it, and the aroma was heavenly. John says Robert Graham from Graham's Grub was not very welcoming to him when he delivered a package tonight, Toria explained to her husband patiently. Do you know why he'd have cause to do that? Mortimer lowered the newspaper into his lap and frowned. No, I can't think of a reason. As far as I know, we've been able to get them everything they've ordered from the mercantile, so it can't be that. Maybe Mr. Graham was just having a bad day. John didn't really believe that, but he didn't want to dwell on a negative experience. Doing that would only spoil his dinner. Stew's ready. Toria ladled healthy scoops of stew into small bowls and handed them to John and Mortimer, then made up a bowl for herself. Mortimer said a prayer, and they all began to eat. This is delicious, Toria. John ate another heaping spoonful. Thank you. You're welcome, John, Toria said. She was glad her stepson appreciated her cooking. Mortimer glanced at the newspaper he had been reading, which he had tossed on the table as he shoveled stew into his mouth. There's an article in here about a few robberies in town. Have either of you heard about them? A look of concern clouded Toria's face. No, I haven't. What's been happening? Mortimer sighed. Apparently, there have been at least 3 in the last month. Toria, I want you to take extra precautions around the house and at the store. One of us should be with you at all times. Toria nodded. I understand, dear. The truth was, she felt this was an overreaction, but she wanted to respect her husband's wishes. She also knew that he had been devastated by his late wife's death. He was only cautious with her because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. It was actually sweet, when she thought about it. I also think we need to take extra precautions around the mercantile. John, in the mornings and evenings, I'd like you and Willie to go through the mercantile and make sure nothing seems off to you. Can you do that? Mortimer continued. John thought about it. We should be able to do that. We'll have to figure out a system so we can do it efficiently and not waste a lot of time because we do need to make all of our delivery stops, too. I trust you'll figure out a good system, Mortimer told his son, and John beamed. After a long time of feeling like he had let his father down, it felt good to know that his father truly trusted him and believed in him. I'll tell Willie tomorrow first thing, and we'll get to work, John said. Thank you, son. Mortimer shook his head. Never can be too careful these days, what with the women going missing lately, the fire, and now robberies. Sometimes, when you think about it, I feel like this town is cursed or something. Please don't say that, Toria pleaded with her husband. Why not, darling? Mortimer's eyes were filled with concern for his wife. She was usually very easygoing, no matter what was going on around her. Creed is our family's home, and there are good parts and bad parts to it. Saying that it's cursed is wrong. I don't think Reverend Bing would like to hear you saying that. Toria looked at Mortimer sternly. She was rarely forceful with her words, but she felt strongly about the subject. There were many problems in Creed, but there were also many good people, like Reverend Bing and his sister Millie, Hannah Wheeler, Beatrice and Arthur Jameson, who were working very hard to make it a better place to live for all of its residents. Mortimer looked sheepish. You're right, Toria. You know sometimes I can overreact. Sometimes? Toria teased. She tried to lighten the mood because it had felt strange to raise her voice earlier. Okay. A good portion of the time, Mortimer admitted. John looked back and forth between Mortimer and Toria and laughed. He hadn't been thrilled when his father had announced he had gotten remarried, but Toria had turned out to be one of the most important people in his life. If she hadn't come into their lives, John thought he might still be wandering around Creed from saloon to saloon, searching for his next drink. Well, even though you may overreact, I'm glad it worked out. Because you and John, our little family, are truly the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm glad we both gave each other a chance, Toria told her husband, her face shining with love. That's it. John jumped up to his feet. Mortimer and Toria stared at him. What's it? Mortimer asked. Gave each other a chance. I know what I need to do. John went out of the room and into his bedroom. A few minutes later, he flew down the stairs, dressed in a white shirt and black pants. I'll be back soon. John called as he rushed out the front door to the house. Mortimer and Toria looked at each other. What's gotten into him? Mortimer wondered out loud. Toria shrugged. Being a stepmother was rewarding, but it was also extremely confusing. Outside, John prepared the horses and the wagon for a trip to Graham's Grub. He wasn't sure if his plan would work, but he had to try it. He wasn't able to get Patience out of his head, and he knew he had to do everything within his power to win her heart. When he arrived at the restaurant, several wagons were parked outside. He made his way to the inside of the restaurant and saw that nearly every table was occupied. Good, John thought. That was part of his plan. All of the male servers in the restaurant wore white shirts and black pants, so John blended right in. Within no time, patrons were asking him for more water or to bring them menus. John was friendly and polite and figured out a way to answer all of their questions. He even cleared a few plates from customers who were done with their meals, stacked them, and dropped them off in the kitchen. Soon, he settled into a groove, and he found that he actually liked the work. It was fast-paced and interesting. No two tables were ever the same. Everyone was enjoying themselves and enjoying the food. Suddenly, John felt a tap on his shoulder as he was about to see if a table had cleared their plates yet. John turned around to find the owner of the small, delicate fingers that had tapped him. It was Patience, looking lovelier than ever in a white silk shirt and long black skirt. Her eyes were blazing. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "I just wanted to," John tried to explain. "Shoo," she whispered furiously. "Storeroom. 5 minutes." John nodded solemnly. He would do anything Patience asked of him. That was a fact as sure as the sky was blue. The next few minutes were a blur of dishes, glasses, and food. The other servers also thought John was a new server, and they gave him errands to run and treated him like a part of the team. As soon as 5 minutes had passed, John raced down the hall to the storeroom. He saw that Patience had propped an empty crate against the bulky door frame to ensure she didn't get locked in again. John nodded admiringly. "I had to see you," John began, walking toward Patience and grabbing her hand. Patience's heart fluttered with excitement that John was touching her. She wanted nothing more than for him to keep touching her, all over her body. Whoa. Where are all these thoughts coming from? Patience tried to refocus on her anger and the issue at hand. "What are you doing here?" John smiled calmly. "I'm proving to your parents that I'm a hard-working, upstanding citizen who deserves a shot to be your husband." At the mention of the word husband, Patience's stomach started doing cartwheels. "Husband? Well, one step at a time, I suppose." John grinned, showing his nice, white teeth. "But I'll say it now, Patience Graham, one day, I intend to marry you." Patience sighed sadly. "I'm glad you have a plan to win my parents over, but right now, they're very upset. They've forbidden me from even talking to you." "Wow. I knew your father was angry with me when he answered the door, but I wasn't sure why. Did he give you the package I brought for you?" John hoped he had. Patience shook her head. "Not yet. But usually my father needs a day or two to cool off after he's gotten angry. I'm going to wait until tomorrow or the next day to ask about my package." "What's in it, by the way?" "Oh, no. You're not getting that out of me, Patience Graham. I'll never tell, you'll have to open it for yourself." John grabbed both of Patience's hands and squeezed them. "I can't believe how good it feels to see you." "It feels good to see you, too," Patience agreed. "Now, we should get back to work. Did you see how busy it is tonight?" "Yes. I'm working harder than I work on my delivery route," John exclaimed. "Good. Hard work is very attractive to me." Patience smiled at John. Despite her irritation, he was incredibly handsome, and he was clearly trying his best. One thing was bothering her, though. Concern flickered across her face. "What is it, Patience?" John asked softly. "It's nothing." Patience felt uncomfortable bringing it up, but she knew she should ask. "My mother heard some rumblings from the women in our church. About you." John immediately knew what she was talking about. He felt ashamed. "This is about my drinking, isn't it? Is that why your parents hate me?" Patience looked nervously down the hall that led to the restaurant's dining room. If her parents caught her in the storeroom, and with John Jackson, no less, they would not be pleased. "They don't hate you, they just don't know you. And yes, you're right, what they've heard about you from their church friends is that you abuse alcohol. They don't want me talking to you at all." John squeezed Patience's hand. "I vow to you, Patience, that I'll be nothing but honest with you any time you ask. Whatever you need, I promise to tell you the whole truth." I trust you. Patience squeezed his hand back. I did have a problem with drinking a while ago. Before my father remarried my stepmother, Toria, I was in a bad way. I was irresponsible. I drank too much. I went out to saloons practically every night, John began. He didn't know why he was being so candid with Patience, but it felt right. What changed? Patience could tell this was hard for John to talk about, but he was trying to be strong for her. When Toria and my father got married, at first, I was mad. I resented her for not being my mother. Eventually, I started to see how good she was for our family. That's when I knew I had to stop drinking, John explained. You mean you just stopped? Isn't that difficult? Patience didn't know much about the problem, but she did have an understanding of what people looked like when they came into the restaurant after having a few too many drinks at one of the saloons. It actually wasn't as hard as I expected. Once I knew that I had made a commitment to my family to behave more responsibly, the rest was much easier. And you also played a part in it, too, John admitted. Me? How is that possible? Patience looked genuinely shocked. Do you remember the first time we met? John asked. Patience nodded. John remembered their first conversation and how impressed he had been by Patience. I was interested in you from the moment I first saw you. I thought you were beautiful and kind and smart and way too good of a person to ever consider being with someone like me. I don't understand what that has to do with your not drinking anymore. Patience frowned. I decided that I would figure out a way to become worthy of your love. It's as simple as that. John looked deep into Patience's eyes. Just like he felt like he could eat her strawberry pie each day for the rest of his life, he felt like he could stare into her eyes every day. Patience was blown away. No one had ever valued her or respected her so much that they would make a major change in their own lives just to gain her approval. She was touched that John valued her opinion so highly. She didn't know what to say. A quiet "thank you" was all she could manage. Patience Graham, I swear to you, I will find a way to make your parents approve of me. And the moment they do, I'm going to make you my bride. That is a promise. John could feel himself getting a little carried away, but he couldn't help himself. When he was with Patience, he felt like he was dancing on air. He couldn't believe his luck in meeting her. I need to be a good example to my new little brother or sister anyway. Patience felt a cold chill come over her, and she remembered that her parents had expressly forbidden her to talk with John Jackson. And here she was holding his hand, an unmarried woman alone in a dark room with a bachelor man known for drinking. If anyone walked in on them in that moment, it would have been a disaster. In her heart, she believed John when he said his drinking days were over and he was working to reform himself. But was that enough? And would that ever be enough for her overprotective parents? Chapter 4. Each night that week, John would return from his delivery route, eat dinner at home very quickly, and hurry over to Graham's grub. For the first few nights, he simply dressed and acted the part. On the fourth night, Robert Graham figured out what was going on. I need to speak with you, son. Robert's gruff voice made John nervous. Let's go into the kitchen. Robert put his hand on John's shoulder and steered him into the kitchen. They passed through a cloud of smoke from a rowdy group of restaurant patrons. What are you doing in my restaurant? Robert demanded as soon as they were out of hearing range. With all due respect, sir, I came here to prove to you that I'm honest, loyal, and hardworking. I'll work here without a wage until the time comes when you see that I'm a good man. John knew he shouldn't press his luck and mention his plan to marry Patience. First, he had to get in the Graham's good graces. Robert frowned, his face covered in red splotches. Why would you work for no wage? That doesn't make sense. It may not make sense to you, Mr. Graham, but a man's name is his worth. I need to do this. John decided to leave it at that. Mr. Graham would either understand and let him stay, or he wouldn't understand, and he'd be kicked out onto the streets. Robert hesitated. He looked back and forth between John and the crowded dining room just beyond the kitchen door. He let out an exasperated sigh. Fine. But this is a trial period only. Don't just stand there. Get to work. Throughout the week, John tried to think of new ways to be helpful around the restaurant. He fixed the door to the storeroom so it wouldn't continue to jam. He rearranged the pots and pans in the kitchen in a way that made more sense to the kitchen staff. He climbed up on a ladder and cleaned windows that were on the second floor of the buildings. Through it all, John hoped the Grahams would start to see him as a new man, a different man than his former reputation suggested. He was kind and honest, and tried to give them plenty of space. He knew that ultimately, their decision would come down to what was in their hearts, and unfortunately, he had no control over that. All he could do was keep showing up and doing the work. Patience was thrilled that John was spending every evening at the restaurant. Sometimes during the day on his delivery route, he'd have Willie deliver a special package just for Patience. He found her small scented soaps, ink pens, and more books he thought she would enjoy. Patience was always extremely grateful for the presents he brought her. She especially loved her hymn book. Little by little, Patience was learning who John Jackson truly was. One morning, as she swept the kitchen, she wondered what her mother thought of John. Lydia frowned. "What do you mean, what do I think of John?" Truth be told, she still had concerns about the man. Creede was a town full of dangers lurking around every corner, and she wasn't convinced that John had managed to fully extricate himself from them yet. "He works very hard at the restaurant. Do you think sometimes people in this town are a little harsh on him because he used to be a drinker?" Patience asked thoughtfully. Lydia looked aghast. "I don't think anyone's being too hard on him. The man was probably hanging around with all of those other unsavory characters in town, like the former sheriff or Archibald Grady." "Mother! How could you say such a thing?" Patience was hurt. John had been working so hard, and all her mother could talk about were his former drinking habits. "You know as well as I do that Creede is dangerous, especially for a young woman." "I'm just looking out for my daughter." Lydia sniffed. Patience's gaze softened. "I know that, Mother. But John really is trying hard. Can you just promise me to give him a chance?" Lydia was torn. She and her husband had always worked hard in order to make sure Patience did not want for anything. Now, her daughter, practically a grown woman, was asking her to accept a man that she cared for. On the other hand, the man in question was a known drinker in a town with a less than stellar track record for keeping young women safe. What was a mother to do? "Patience, I've thought about it, and I will pray on it. I understand this is very important to you, and you know I love you. But as your mother, I also need to keep you safe from harm. I feel I am in a difficult position. Can you see that?" Lydia hoped her daughter would understand. Patience nodded. "I hope you come to the right answer, Mother. John really is a wonderful person." "I know you believe that, Patience, but you need to respect your parents' wishes. We only want what's best for you, and even while John works here, we would prefer you do not speak with him," Lydia replied. Patience continued to sweep the floor. "Yes, Mother. I understand. I'm going to the bank to make a deposit. We can start preparing for lunch when I get back." Lydia kissed her daughter on the cheek and left the kitchen. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the front entrance to Graham's Grub. Patience went to answer it. John stood on the doorstep wearing a huge grin and carrying a small, neatly wrapped package. Patience looked around to make sure no one else could see them. "Come inside, quickly," Patience whispered. John stepped inside, and Patience closed the door. "Why all the secrecy?" John seemed amused. "My parents still don't want me speaking with you," Patience explained. John's face fell. "Oh. I thought I was making progress." "I think you are." Patience tried to reassure John. "They're just very set in their ways. These things take some time. That's all." "Sure." John didn't seem convinced. He turned his gaze to his package. "This is for you." "Oh, John, thank you. You don't need to keep bringing me gifts. Don't get me wrong. I love them. I just want to make sure you don't feel like you have to bring me a gift every day. I enjoy bringing you gifts. John shook his head. When are you going to realize that? When I see you smile, it makes my day. Patience blushed. You're so sweet. Thank you again. Are you going to open it? John prodded. I'm glad you like it, John said. But how did you find someone who would embroider it for you? Patience asked, suddenly a bit nervous. If word got out about him finding a woman to do it for him, would her parents get upset with him again? Don't worry. It was part of a shipment my father received. I think it refers to patience, the virtue, but I thought it would work equally well because of your name, John reassured her. He knew exactly why she was worried. If he had asked his stepmother or anyone else in Creed to stitch Patience's name on anything, word would have traveled around town quickly. Good thinking. I love it. Thank you, John. Patience wished she could do something kind for John in return, but nothing came to mind. She also knew she needed to get him out of the house before her mother returned and found him there. You're welcome. John loved looking at Patience, but it seemed like something was troubling the young woman. What's wrong? I hate to be rude, especially after you gave me such a thoughtful gift, but my parents have made it abundantly clear that they do not want me speaking to you. I think you need to leave before they see you here. Patience worried that John would leave in anger and never return. I understand. But I want to let you know I won't give up hope. I plan to work as many shifts at the restaurant as it takes until I've earned your parents' trust. I'm never going to give up on you, Patience Graham. John's gaze was steady and devoted, and Patience knew he meant it. He took her hand, brought it to his lips, and kissed it. Chills ran up and down her spine, and her stomach did a flip. Patience watched as John opened the door, looked around to make sure her parents weren't in sight, and went back to his wagon. As he drove off, she sighed as she imagined what it would be like once her parents finally accepted John. She knew John meant what he had said, but she also knew how firm and unyielding her parents could be. Would John grow impatient and give up on her? He said he wouldn't now, but what if he worked at the restaurant for years and years and the Grahams refused to yield? Just thinking about it made Patience sad. She tried to distract herself by cleaning up the kitchen so she and her mother could start preparing lunch as soon as Lydia returned. At times like this, she was glad that the restaurant was a family business. There was rarely a time when she didn't have a chore or a task to complete. She never sat idle, because there was always more to do. This came in handy when she was trying to avoid thinking about a certain deliveryman's broad shoulders and handsome face. John returned to the mercantile and found Willie putting away supplies from the latest shipment. Where have you been? I've unpacked 4 crates so far. Willie exclaimed. I needed to make an urgent delivery, John explained. Willie frowned. No, because when there's an urgent delivery, Toria writes it down on the list for the day. There were no urgent deliveries marked down for today. John sighed. Keeping his special gifts for Patience secret from Willie was proving to be more difficult than he anticipated. Fortunately, Toria interrupted them before Willie could ask any more questions. John and Willie, this shipment was larger than I expected. Do you think you could do the rest of your deliveries tomorrow and help unload all the other crates in the back? That would be fine, John told his stepmother. No problem, Willie agreed. Thank you. Oh. And I need to go into the house and check on the roast I'm making for dinner. Could you watch the shop for a while? Your father is at the bank, Toria said. Not a problem. John took one of the empty crates Willie had just unloaded and put it in the back of the mercantile. He found one of the full crates and walked it to the front of the store. He and his father both tried to get Toria to rest during the day while she was expecting, so he was pleased to see her take a break. Thank you. Toria went upstairs, to the Jacksons' living quarters. As John began unpacking the crate, 3 men walked through the front door of the mercantile. Though it was early afternoon, one of them was stumbling, and the other 2 men were supporting him. John, the drunk man, Riley Adams, called out. Our long-lost friend. Willie stiffened as he saw the men approach and looked at John, trying to figure out what to do. He didn't like the feeling he got when he saw these men. He had seen them around town before, and they were never up to anything good. John smiled at Willie. He had the situation under control. "Hello, gentlemen. What can I do for you today?" Grant Peters, who was holding Riley upright, grinned at John, revealing his mouth full of crooked yellow teeth. "You're the man we wanted to see." The third man, Roger Seaborn, ran his hands over a set of china on display. The shelf it was on rattled a little, and John walked over to hold it steady. "We have something we know you'll be interested in." "Is that right?" "What would that be?" John asked calmly. Though Riley, Grant, and Roger were among his former close friends, he knew that he did not want to spend any more time with them. They were drinkers and gamblers, spending nearly all their paychecks just as soon as they received them. "Archie Grady's organizing a poker game tonight. We are all going to play," Grant explained. "Thank you for letting me know, but I'm not interested," John replied quickly. John didn't trust a single thing that had to do with Archie Grady. The man was rotten to the core, and people who got mixed up with him seemed to have terrible fates befall them. "Why not?" Riley cried. "You don't want to have fun with us anymore?" John turned to look at Grant. "You two really should take Riley home so he can sleep this off. He does not look well." "I'm fine," Riley shouted. Willie felt worse and worse. He knew if Toria came back into the store, she would not be happy. Still, he wasn't sure what to do. He continued to unload items from the crate onto the shelves. He tried to ignore the men's loud conversation. Hopefully, they'd be gone soon. John walked up to Riley and put his arm around him. "Riley, clearly you've had too much to drink. It's the middle of the day, and there are good, decent people going about their business, trying to have a nice day. I suggest you go home, splash some water on your face, and get a good night's rest. Got it?" Riley scowled at John and wriggled out of his grasp. "Where's the fun in that?" Roger asked. "What happened to the John Jackson who went out drinking with us nearly every evening? What happened to the John Jackson who never passed up an opportunity to play in a poker tournament?" Grant added. "I'm done with all of that now," John told them. "I don't need to drink to have a good time. I have other things that take up my time." Grant and Roger looked amused. Riley staggered around the store, not paying attention to the conversation. Willie kept his eye on him, not wanting him to damage any of the merchandise. "Come on, John. Come out with us. We haven't seen you in so long." "You've turned your back on your friends," Grant accused. John felt like a true friend would support him in his decision to give up drinking, but he didn't want to cause trouble. He just wanted to get his so-called friends out of the mercantile as soon as possible before they broke something. "It's going to be a lot of fun," Roger chimed in. John tried to be as polite and peaceable as he could. "No thank you, gentlemen. Now, did you need anything today? How can I help you?" "If you aren't here to purchase anything, I'm afraid I need to get back to work." "What's wrong with you?" Grant cried, his face showing a sudden flash of anger. "You've changed." John nodded calmly. "That's right, Grant. I have. Now, I suggest you three leave the mercantile and go about your day." "You're going to regret this," Grant vowed. He turned to Roger. "Let's go." Grant and Roger walked over to Riley and helped him stand up straight. As they walked to the front door, Toria came back down into the mercantile and watched them stumble along. "What was that about?" "I heard their voices all the way from upstairs," Toria told John. John sighed. "Unfortunately, those are a few old friends of mine, from when I was drinking. I know it doesn't seem like a smart decision to associate with men like that, but at the time, I enjoyed spending time with them. Now I realize that the only thing we had in common was drinking." Through the window, Toria could see the three men slowly lurching down the street together. "You need to be careful with that group. They sounded like they were up to no good." "Trust me, Toria. I can handle them. I haven't had a drop to drink in months, and I feel a lot better." I think I'm becoming the man I need to be in order to be a good husband and father. John blushed. One day, I mean. Not necessarily now. Toria had a strong hunch that John was talking about Patience Graham, but she didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable or draw too much attention to the subject. If John and Patience were meant to be a couple, they'd find their way to one another somehow, just as she and Mortimer had. She was pleased to see her stepson taking responsibility for his actions. Still, Toria couldn't shake the feeling that the three men who had behaved badly in the store might cause trouble for him down the line. It's not you I'm worried about, John. I know you can handle their antics. It's them I'm worried about. I'm not sure at what lengths men like that would go to in order to get their way. I know you're a little protective of me, and I appreciate that. But I think you are overreacting in this situation. I'll be fine, John reassured his stepmother. Toria put a hand on his shoulder. You're probably right, John. You can't blame me for wanting what's best for you, though. John shook his head. He was lucky to have someone who cared about him so much. When his father had remarried, he had worried that there would be no room in his new marriage for his adult son. Instead, Toria had been nothing but warm and generous to him. She had never tried to take the place of his late mother. Instead, she tried to make his life better and support him. She was an incredible woman and a wonderful wife to his father. John hoped that one day, he'd be blessed with the same kind of love that Toria and Mortimer shared. And he especially hoped that the person he'd find that love with was Patience Graham. Chapter 5. Patience soaked a rag in warm, soapy water, wrung it out, and carried it into the restaurant's main dining room. She wiped and scrubbed each table until it gleamed. As she cleaned, there was a knock at the front entrance to the restaurant. Patience looked up at the large clock hanging on the wall. There were 2 hours before the restaurant would open for lunch. Before she could go to the door, Robert strode to the entrance from the kitchen. I'll get it, dear. Robert opened the door. We're not open until noon, young man. Actually, I'm here about something else. May I have a few moments of your time, sir? Alexander Jacobs thrust his hand out. Robert shook it. Yes, but only a few moments. We're preparing to serve lunch. He stepped aside and ushered the young man in. Alexander had dark hair and hazel eyes. Patience had seen him before in town but didn't know him well. Although he moved his lips so they were turned up into a smile, his eyes seemed hard and angry. Patience did not have a good feeling about the man. We can talk in my office. Robert led Alexander down one of the narrow corridors to his small office. The desk and floor were covered in stacks of paperwork, and Robert had to squeeze around the desk in order to get to his chair. Please excuse the mess. We are having a profitable year, but that leaves me little time to clean, I'm afraid. Alexander sat down in the chair nearest to the door. Alexander launched right into his request. Sir, I believe you know my father, Andrew Jacobs, who owns the hotel on the other side of town. I manage the front desk. I have a good, steady job and now I'm ready to settle down and find a wife to share my life with. I'd like to ask your permission to court your daughter, Patience. She's the most beautiful young woman in town, and anyone would be lucky to have her as a wife. Robert folded his hands together, thinking. I think that would be fine. I do know your father, and he's a good man. I also know that several men are going to want to court my daughter, and I won't be able to stay in denial much longer. My daughter is growing up. If you want to ask her out on a date, you have my permission. Thank you, sir. I'll leave you to get to your busy day. Alexander stood up, and Robert walked him out to the front of the restaurant. Patience, Robert called. This young man would like a word with you. Robert returned to the kitchen to give Alexander and Patience some privacy. He was thrilled that a young, wealthy man like Alexander was interested in Patience. John Jackson had been spending far too much time at the restaurant, and Robert was suspicious of the feelings between John and his daughter. Robert had to admit that John was growing on him, but that didn't mean he wanted a man with a wild reputation to marry his only daughter. Someone like Alexander was a far more suitable match. In the dining area, Patience paused and waited for Alexander to explain himself. Patience, I'd like to take you out on a date. Would you like that? Alexander asked. Patience looked down at the floor. She was slightly upset that this was what her father and Alexander had discussed in his office. She knew her father would look out for her best interests, but she felt that in her heart, she was already spoken for. John was the man she spent her days and nights dreaming about, not anyone else. She didn't know Alexander well and didn't care to. He seemed like many of the other men in town, concerned with money and nothing more. She knew her father probably felt Alexander was a suitable match due to his wealth, but she far preferred John's kind, gentle gaze and thoughtful gifts. Still, she knew that there were no guarantees with John. For one thing, she was worried about his drinking. Though she thought about him a lot, she was concerned that her future may be put in jeopardy by his behavior. For another, even if John behaved perfectly for the rest of his life, there was a good chance the Grahams would never approve of him for marriage. If that were the case, maybe it wouldn't be so terrible to be married to Alexander Jacobs. He certainly would be able to offer her a comfortable life. And if anything happened to her parents, and they became ill, he could easily provide for them, too. Something about him just made Patience feel strange, but she tried to ignore that feeling. Yes. I'd like that, Patience finally replied after going back and forth in her head. Alexander's lips curled up into another smile, but once again, his eyes remained indifferent. I'll see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock. I'll meet you here. I'll have to ask my parents if I can leave. I usually work here for the dinner shift, Patience explained. That's fine. Alexander seemed bored. I can wait while you ask. I'll be right back. Patience walked toward the kitchen, where her mother was preparing a pasta with chicken and mushrooms for lunch. Robert was adding up figures at the table. Mother, Father, Alexander Jacobs has asked if I can go on a date with him tomorrow evening. Is it all right if I leave the restaurant starting at 5 o'clock tomorrow? Lydia smiled as she stirred the pasta. Robert had told her about Alexander's interest, and she thought he was a smart match for her daughter. That's perfectly fine, dear. Patience frowned. What about the restaurant? Who will serve? I'll find someone to take your place. Don't worry about us. You should enjoy yourself. Lydia told her daughter. Patience worked hard every day of the week. She deserved an evening to have fun and get to know Alexander better. Lydia had seen the house the Jacobs family owned, and it was beautiful and spacious. If Patience married into the Jacobs family, Lydia would never worry about her daughter's future again. Okay. Thank you, Patience said quietly. I'll get back to cleaning now. After she had left the kitchen, Robert turned to Lydia. She seemed a little sad, didn't she? What do you think is the problem? Lydia pressed her lips together into a straight line. I'm worried it has something to do with that John Jackson. I've worried the same thing before, Robert admitted. Do you think I should ask him to stop coming to the restaurant? Yes, I think that would be wise, Lydia agreed. Robert set his pencil down on the table. I have nothing against the young man, but for our daughter, he just doesn't seem right. I agree with you, dear. Lydia removed the pasta from the stovetop and set it aside to cool. Now, we need to make sure our daughter feels the same way. Out in the dining area, Patience felt a cold breeze as she imagined a life with Alexander Jacobs. That's because he isn't the right man for you, Patience. The dark-haired woman who had appeared to Patience in the storeroom had returned, and she was standing right in front of Patience. How did you get in? I didn't hear the door. Patience looked around, trying to figure out where the woman had come from. That doesn't matter in the least. What matters is that you heed my advice. If you marry Alexander Jacobs, your life will be in grave danger. The woman's eyes pleaded for Patience to take her seriously. How do you know all of this? Who are you? Patience couldn't help but raise her voice. She felt frustrated and confused. Why was a woman she didn't know offering her advice on one of the most important decisions in life? The woman shook her head sadly. You're not ready to know who I am. But I know you, Patience. And I know that you're about to make a huge mistake, one that you can never recover from. Will you at least tell me your name? This is ridiculous. Patience had had enough of the woman's dramatic warnings. She wanted to continue cleaning the restaurant and be able to carry on with her day. She didn't want to keep talking to a woman who acted like she knew everything. I don't have a name in the same way you do. But you may call me Sarah, if you insist. The woman looked around the empty restaurant. But time will quickly run out, Patience. You need to make the right choice. You're meant to be with John Jackson. You must marry him. Patience wanted to cry. Why was this woman bothering her over and over again? Didn't she have anything better to do? Was she one of the people who lived in Mrs. Franklin's boarding house? It wasn't terribly far away, and sometimes, Mrs. Franklin took in people who were confused or had problems. I don't understand why you keep telling me these terrible things. What am I supposed to do about them? You need to give John a chance. You have judged him too harshly. You'll soon find out that he deserves better. Sarah smiled. It will all work out, Patience. I promise. How do you know that? Patience asked in exasperation. How do I know what? Lydia brought a vase of flowers into the dining area. She began arranging it on a table near the front entrance. Patience looked up. The woman had disappeared, but she hadn't heard her walk away or open any of the doors. Nothing, Mother. Dear, are you all right? Maybe you should take the rest of the afternoon to rest, before your date tomorrow with Alexander. I don't want you coming down with anything. Lydia walked over to her daughter and felt her forehead. You don't feel feverish. Just the same, you should rest up. Patience didn't feel physically sick, but she did feel awful when she considered Sarah's warnings. She had no idea what to do about her feelings for John or her date with Alexander. Every time she thought about John's gifts or the way he made her laugh, she smiled and felt a warm, glowing feeling come over her entire body. When she thought about Alexander, it was practically the opposite. It felt like there was a cold chill in the room. Then, the familiar worry about John's drinking crept in. He told her he had stopped, but what if he started again? Patience saw many men in Creed drink and gamble away all of the money they earned through work. Their wives and families suffered mightily because of their greed and corruption. She had always dreamed of a large family. Would John be able to provide that for her? That evening, when John arrived at the restaurant to work, Patience met him at the front door. I'd like to speak with you privately, Patience told him. I hope I'm not in trouble. John started to laugh, but stopped when he saw Patience's face. Let's go somewhere we can talk. Patience led John to the small space behind the restaurant. She walked into a small clearing, surrounded by several fir trees. Wow, John exhaled. This is beautiful. Yes. I like to come here to think sometimes. It's quiet and peaceful. Patience looked around. She loved this spot, and it felt right to be here with John. But she still had some questions for him. As you know, I told you I wanted to get to know you better before agreeing to go on a date. But the problem is there's something I can't stop thinking about. What's that? John asked earnestly. He would do anything for Patience. He hated to see something bothering her. John, everyone around town has warned my mother and father that you're a drinker. I've heard stories, too. When I think about the man I want to marry, drinking just doesn't fit into the picture. Do you understand? Patience tried to be as gentle as possible, but she felt her words were harsher than she intended. Patience, I fully understand your concerns. John took her hands into his. I have made mistakes in the past. But I've moved on, and I have you to thank for it. I promise to you, I'll never drink a drop of alcohol again. If that's what it takes to have you in my life, I'll never even touch the stuff. Patience believed John, and she loved the way his warm hands were wrapped around hers. She nodded. Thank you, John. John leaned forward and pulled Patience in closer. He locked his lips onto hers, pushing gently, let go of her hands, and wrapped his arms around her waist. Patience moved closer to him, feeling full from his warmth and love. When Patience recovered from the shock of it, she pulled herself away from John and stepped back. "We shouldn't have done that." John had a smirk on his face. "That's a shame, because it felt wonderful to me." "That's beside the point." Patience felt her face turning red. "I need to go. Now will you agree to go out on a date with me?" John asked. He knew what her answer would be. Patience looked pained. "My parents want me to go on a date with Alexander Jacobs. He asked my parents' permission, and they agreed." "I'm sorry, John. I should have told you sooner." John shook his head. He wasn't worried about Alexander Jacobs. "Then you need to give me a chance, too. It's only fair." "My parents don't seem convinced, John. I know you've changed, but your reputation is still damaged in their minds." "I'm sorry, but they haven't changed their minds yet." Patience felt horrible. John looked crushed by the news, but tried to take it in stride. "I'll keep working at it. That's all I can do. But Patience, please remember to give me a chance. I'm sure Alexander can offer you a whole lot, nice clothing, lots of money, a large house, but he will never have what you and I have." Patience bit her lower lip. She hoped John was right. How could he be so sure? John looked toward the restaurant. "I really should go inside so I can start working. Please remember what I said." John pulled Patience close again and kissed her on the forehead. Patience felt another small ripple of happiness when John's lips brushed against her skin. Patience waited for John to walk away so no one would see them together. Her parents had given her the evening off, too, saying she needed a break. She didn't know what she would do all night. She liked staying busy, and the restaurant provided ample opportunity for that. She decided to go back to her room and read through the hymn book John had given her. John knocked on the front entrance of the door, and Robert Graham answered. "Hi, John." He looked at the younger man uneasily. "Hello, Mr. Graham. I was thinking about the pipe in the back that's causing you trouble." "I have an idea," John began. "Son, I'm afraid we no longer need your services here." Robert hated to see John go. He was a hard worker and smart, too. But it wasn't right to allow John to continue working there in the hopes of courting Robert's daughter. John's face showed confusion. "But sir, I don't need money. I'm only here to prove myself to you and your family." Robert sighed. "I know that, son. And we appreciate your work, all of it. But we don't see you as the type of man we want our daughter to marry. We like you, and we hope you'll find another nice girl to settle down with. But it won't be our daughter." Robert shook his head sadly. John couldn't believe it. He had been working day and night to prove his love for Patience was true. He was exhausted, his hands had calluses, and his back ached from working all day delivering packages and all evening at the restaurant. And now, Robert was telling him his services were no longer needed? John wanted to scream or punch someone, but he knew neither of those was an option if he ever wanted to impress Robert Graham. Instead, John nodded slowly. "I understand. I don't like your decision or agree with it, but I can understand that you need to protect your daughter. Please know, though, Mr. Graham, that you and I are not very different. I care for your daughter and want what's best for her, too." John turned to leave. "Thank you, son," Robert Graham called out to John. It was unfortunate that he wouldn't be able to stay on at the restaurant, because Robert had come to appreciate working with him. But he just didn't see John as the man who could provide the wonderful life he had imagined for his daughter. From the trees, Patience's eyes filled with tears as she watched John walk away. She had overheard his conversation with her father, and she couldn't believe how cruel her father was being. Didn't they respect her wishes at all? It wasn't fair. Even with his history, John was 10 times the man Alexander Jacobs would ever be. Patience sat down on the ground and closed her eyes. She needed to think. There had to be a way to make this right. At the Jackson house, John arrived home much earlier than usual. Mortimer furrowed his brow. "What are you doing home so early? I thought you were helping at the restaurant tonight." John sighed. I don't want to talk about it. Mortimer was reading a book, and Toria was seated at the table, doing the monthly accounting duties for the mercantile. She had a special talent for making everything balance and knowing exactly how to handle any issues that arose, and Mortimer was quite content to let her work her magic. Now, Toria looked up at her stepson's dejected face. Is there anything we can help with? I don't see how. John stared at the floor. It might help you to get it off your chest and tell us what's bothering you. Toria knew she might be pushing too hard, but sometimes John only needed a little prompting. Robert Graham told me my help is no longer needed at the restaurant. They don't think I'm husband material for their daughter. Even after I've worked so hard. John's tone wavered a bit as he tried to keep the anger out of his voice. Toria could feel herself getting worked up on his behalf. Well, that doesn't seem fair. You were offering to work for him without pay. He didn't even give you a chance. Mortimer glanced at Toria, hoping she could try to stay level-headed about this. He was glad his wife and stepson shared a strong friendship, but sometimes, Toria wasn't objective when it came to John. She felt a strong urge to protect him and make sure he was treated fairly since his own mother had died and could no longer fill that role. This meant that she sometimes reacted with emotion instead of logic when it came to John. John nodded sadly. I know. Now I'll never have a chance with Patience. Alexander Jacobs has asked her on a date. They'll probably get married and have lots of babies who will grow up to think of themselves as important businessmen. Mortimer almost laughed at this thought but knew it would be inappropriate. I'm sorry, son. That's unfortunate. I'm proud of you for working hard and doing the right thing. Maybe one day, the Grahams will come around. Remember, we are both here if you need anything, Toria reminded John. I think right now, I just want to be alone. John hung his head and walked to his bedroom. Toria and Mortimer exchanged a concerned look. Toria felt helpless. I wonder if there's anything we could do. Mortimer's eyes widened. Oh, no. No, what? Toria blinked innocently. Please, Toria, John's a grown man. You can't fight his battles for him. Mortimer set his book down. Toria's eyes were bright. I know, Mortimer. I'm not going to. I just wish there were a way for Patience's parents to see the John we see at home. They're really judging him based on his former reputation, and that's not accurate. I think we should leave it alone. It will work itself out. Mortimer picked his book back up again. Toria didn't say anything. She went back to her accounting work. She had a few ideas in mind for how she could help John, but she didn't want to worry her husband. In his room, John fumed. He couldn't believe that a man like Alexander Jacobs was going to take Patience on a date when he himself could not. He knew he needed to channel his anger into something productive, but he wasn't sure what to do. He paced the length of his bedroom and thought about it. What more could he do to show Patience how serious he was about her? Just then, he heard a few soft thuds against his window. Puzzled, he threw open the shade and looked down at the ground. A figure in a cloak was throwing rocks at his window. Hey! John called, angry. Stop that. John flew out into the living area. His parents were still in their relaxed positions. Did you hear that? John cried. Someone was throwing stones at my window. Toria and Mortimer exchanged a glance. No, John. I haven't heard anything. Toria stood up and looked out the nearest window. I don't see anyone down there. John wasn't satisfied with that answer. I'm going down there to find out. He stomped downstairs to the mercantile and went outside. He looked all around for a figure in a cloak, but he didn't see anyone. John circled the outside of the mercantile. It was early evening, and the sun had almost set. There were a few people out walking and even more passing by in wagons. He didn't see the person who had been throwing rocks, though. John decided to go around the mercantile one last time before he went upstairs. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the cloak and began to run up to the person. It was the strangest thing, the closer John thought he was getting, the farther away the cloaked figure appeared. "Wait!" John panted as he raced ahead. The cloak disappeared into a corner, and John followed soon after. Suddenly, he ran into someone with a huge thud. John fell back and then pulled himself to his feet. When he looked up, he realized that the person he'd run into was Patience. John rubbed his head. "What are you doing here?" They were in the middle of Main Street, and it was nearly dark. This was no place for a young woman like Patience to be by herself. "I was going to come find you at the Mercantile, but then it got so dark. I was about to turn back, and then, for some reason, I decided to stay right here. And then you ran into me." Patience was just as surprised as John. "I should ask you the same question. What are you doing here?" John shook his head. He wanted to tell Patience about the figure who had been throwing rocks, but he felt foolish. The person was nowhere to be seen. I had a feeling I needed to be in this exact spot, so I came here. I wanted to apologize for earlier. I've thought about it, and I don't think my parents are right about you. Even if they don't approve, I don't care. I want to go on a date with you." Patience felt nervous telling John exactly how she felt. John felt his heart lift in his chest. He was so relieved and excited that Patience had changed her mind. He knew it must have taken a lot for her to disobey her parents' wishes. "Thank you, Patience. I promise that you won't regret this." John grabbed Patience's hand and put his lips to the back of it. A thrill ran up her arm at his touch. "I'm a lucky man," John whispered hoarsely. Patience blushed. She was glad the sun was setting, so John couldn't see her embarrassment. However, the sunset also was a problem. She was not allowed to be out after dark on her own. John watched the last rays of light fade with the same concern. "Patience, while I'm delighted that I get to go on a date with you, I think right now, the best idea is to get you home." Patience nodded. "I didn't realize how late it was. I'll walk you there." John offered Patience his arm. Patience hesitated. "But my parents will see you." "I'll hide in the trees while I make sure you get to your door safely," John offered. Patience considered this. She looped her arm around his. "All right." John and Patience set off for the restaurant. It was longer than John normally would have walked, but he could walk anywhere with Patience on his arm. "I must admit, I've been thinking about you all day," John told Patience. Patience smiled. "Me too. I wish we could spend time like that together, just the two of us, all the time," John told her. Patience sighed. That would be wonderful. She imagined what her life might be like with John by her side. She still had a few doubts, but in that moment, standing with John in the middle of town, walking arm in arm, there was no place in the world she would rather be. Chapter 6. As John and Patience approached Graham's Grub, they heard shouts and yelling from the street. John pulled Patience off the main road, and they hid on the side of one of the buildings so they could see what was going on. The crowd cleared a bit, and John and Patience could see a young man lying on the road, clutching his side. "We need a doctor," another young man called, sounding scared. "Is anyone here a doctor?" Most of the people in the crowd just pointed and stared. Robert and Lydia Graham raced out onto the street. "I've sent one of the boys to get Dr. Thomas," Robert explained to the crowd. "Did anyone see the man who got away?" Lydia, holding a towel, walked over to the young man and pressed the towel to his side. Everyone began shouting. He was a tall man. He was a short man. His hair was black as night. He had no hair at all. He went east. I saw him go south. Finally, Robert put 2 fingers between his lips and let out a loud, long whistle. "The marshal will be here soon. He'll need to talk to anyone who saw the man with the knife." At the sight of the building, Patience shivered. It wasn't cold in temperature, but she felt terrible knowing that someone had been hurt inside her parents' restaurant. Something else was bothering her, too. John rubbed Patience's arms, trying to help her get warm. "I'm sure you're scared right now, Patience, but don't worry. Everything will be all right." Patience chewed on her lip. "That could have been me lying on the ground. If I had been working tonight. Shoo, John put a finger to her mouth. It wasn't you. You're right here, and I've got you now. Patience did feel much better when she was wrapped in John's embrace, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had escaped a terrible fate. Maybe there was something to what that Sarah woman had said after all. Dr. J.T. Thomas pulled up in a wagon just then, and the crowd parted to allow him to park. Dr. Thomas hopped out of his wagon and rushed to the wounded young man. Robert and Lydia conferred with him in hushed tones. Patience looked toward Graham's grub. I need to find a way back inside before my parents realize I'm not there. They didn't know you left your house? John was confused. Patience shook her head. They think I'm in my room. I was already going to disobey their rules, and I didn't think sneaking out would hurt. John surveyed the crowd, then looked at the building they were hiding behind. I have an idea. John took Patience's hand and led her behind the other buildings, and toward the wooded area just outside of Graham's grub. Tiptoeing so they wouldn't attract attention, John and Patience made their way closer and closer to the restaurant. Is there a back entrance? John whispered. Patience nodded. She pointed to where it was along the side of the building. There were some trees nearby, and John and Patience darted behind them to stay out of sight. The crowd was still focused on the young man who had been stabbed and Dr. Thomas's attempts to save his life. When they got close to the side door, Patience turned to John. I can make it from here. Thank you so much. Of course. I'll see you soon, Patience. Once again, John brought Patience's hands to his lips and kissed her delicately. Patience felt a flutter in her stomach and reminded herself that she needed to get back into her house. Yes. See you soon. She quickly walked the rest of the short distance to the side door of the house and used her set of keys to unlock it. She pulled the door shut behind her and sank down onto the floor, exhaling in relief. She had made it inside without her parents realizing she had left. Her heart was still pounding from spending time with John, but she knew she had better go back to her room before her parents came inside and wondered what she was doing on the floor. She stood up and returned to her room, lying down on her bed and replaying the events of the last few hours. She still couldn't believe that she and John had somehow ended up at the exact same spot in town. He always seemed to show up when she needed him the most. Patience yawned, exhausted from all the emotions she had gone through during the day. She decided to go to sleep early. As she started to drift off, she imagined a big, beautiful wedding at the local church. John stood at the altar, awaiting his bride. And later, they'd move into a lovely house and begin to fill it one by one with children. Patience could see it all so clearly. She was starting to believe that Sarah, the mysterious stranger who kept showing up in unexpected places, was right. She and John were meant to be together. But how would she get her parents to see that? What could she possibly do to change their minds? The following evening, Patience went on her date with Alexander Jacobs to satisfy her parents. Throughout the evening, Alexander continued to make comments about his family's wealth that made Patience feel uncomfortable. She had always thought it best to only talk about money with family. She and Alexander barely knew each other. She also noticed that Alexander was just as stiff and cold as usual at dinner. She felt none of the warmth or joy that enveloped her when she was with John. At the end of the evening, when Alexander drove her home, she was secretly relieved the date was over. When Alexander pulled the wagon in front of her house, he walked her to her front door and gave her a kiss on the cheek. I hope to take you out again one day, Patience, Alexander told her. Patience didn't know what to say. Thank you for everything. Good night. Alexander waved goodbye to her and got back into his wagon. Good night. Lydia was waiting up for Patience. As soon as Patience walked into the living room of their home, Lydia was there to pepper her with questions. How was it? Where did you go? Did you meet any of his family? Patience laughed. Fine. To a restaurant in Bachelor. No. In that order. Lydia frowned. He took you to Bachelor? The road between Crete and Bachelor was along a narrow stretch of land with a steep drop-off into the canyon below. More than a few people had lost their lives to the dangerous pass. Lydia didn't like that on the first date. Alexander had put her daughter's life in danger. Yes, there was a restaurant there he said was his favorite, Patience explained. Why isn't Graham's grub his favorite? Lydia wondered out loud. Patience grinned. Mother. You know I'm only teasing, dear. Did you two enjoy yourselves? Lydia asked, looking down at the quilt squares she was sewing together. Patience paused. She didn't want to be dishonest, but she also didn't want to upset her mother. It was interesting. Lydia set down her sewing. Interesting? What does that mean? Patience decided to tell her mother the full truth. It means I don't think we have a strong connection. I don't plan to go on any other dates with him. Lydia sighed. It was only the first date, dear. You may feel differently once you get to know him a bit better. Trust me, Mother, I doubt my feelings will change. Patience's tone was so adamant that Lydia didn't protest any further. I can't say I'm not disappointed, but I believe you if you say you don't want to get to know him any better, Lydia told her daughter. Thank you, Mother. If you don't mind, I'm exhausted. I'm going to go to bed now. Good night. Patience kissed her mother on the cheek and went into her bedroom. Though she had spent her night with Alexander, John Jackson was the only man she could think about. Thoughts of John ran through her head day and night. Now she just had to figure out what to do about it. For the rest of the week, Patience and John continued to find ways to see each other in secret. Whenever John and Willie had a package for Graham's grub, John would write a note to Patience and manage to slip it to her when they delivered the package. Patience was the happiest she had been since moving to Creed. She felt like John understood her and wanted the same things out of life that she wanted. She fantasized about what they might wear to their wedding and what their future children might look like. One evening, John sneaked out of his parents' house to meet Patience. He had a special gift for her. Whenever John wanted to see Patience while she was at home, they had developed a system. John tapped a specific pattern of knocks against the side door, which was closest to Patience's bedroom. Patience opened her door and checked the hallway to confirm John would have a clear path. She then rushed toward the side door and opened it, letting John in. From there, they typically went to the storeroom, where it was dark, and their voices wouldn't carry into other parts of the restaurant. That evening, Patience met John at the door and led him to the storeroom. Once he had pulled the door closed, John pulled Patience in and wrapped his arms around her. He bent down and kissed the tip of her nose, then pressed his lips against hers. Patience pulled back a little. John. I still feel strange carrying on like this in my parents' house. John sighed. I know I need to wait a little longer. But you have this effect on me, Patience. I can't help myself. Patience giggled. She felt a little out of control when she was near John, too. How was your day? It was great, John declared. Why was that? Patience asked. John pulled a small jewelry box from his pocket. Because I decided to do this. Patience Graham, I've had feelings for you since I met you. I've turned my life around, and I have you to thank for it. Now, I can't imagine my life without you. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? John opened the jewelry box to reveal a key. Patience covered her mouth with her hand. She had dreamed of a life with John, but she had no idea that he was going to ask for her hand in marriage. She wanted to shout, yes, but then she thought of her parents and their disapproval. Was it wrong to accept a marriage proposal if your parents were strongly against it? What's wrong, Patience? John was worried about the faraway look he saw on Patience's face. He knew it only meant trouble. I'm sorry, John. I was just thinking about my parents. Accepting your marriage proposal would make me so happy, and I want them to share in my happiness. Patience tried to explain it to John, but she wasn't sure she was doing a very good job. John nodded. I know your parents are very important to you. Suddenly, the stranger's words flashed back to Patience. Perhaps since they were in the storeroom where Sarah had first appeared, or perhaps because the mystery was still bothering Patience, She remembered what Sarah had said about needing to disobey her parents to be with the man she loved. John, please excuse me for answering in such a long-winded way. The truth is I would love to marry you. John gave a happy-sounding laugh and lifted Patience off the ground. You've made me so happy, Patience. Oh, John, it's so lovely. Patience declared. When can we get married? I can't wait to be your wife. John shook his head in amazement. He had trouble keeping up with Patience. It seemed like moments ago she was upset because her parents wouldn't approve of their marriage. Now, she wanted to get married as quickly as possible. I can't wait either. I do have one question, though. Patience pointed at the small key in John's hand. What is that? John laughed. I was wondering when you would ask about that. I explained tonight to my father that you and I have been seeing each other and that we plan to marry. He's going to let me stay with him until we are married, and then, after the ceremony, you and I will move into a little house I bought on the outskirts of town. This key is for you. John pressed the key into Patience's palm. Patience felt tears gather in her eyes. She was so touched by John's gift to her. It was perfect. Now, I'm not saying this will be our home forever. I'll have to keep working hard at the mercantile, but one day, I'd like to build you another house, a big house, something beautiful that you deserve. And that can fit all the dozens of children I'd like to have with you. John raised one eyebrow to Patience to show he was teasing. Dozens of children? Oh my. Patience laughed. I can't help it, Patience. I'm completely in love with you. John smiled at his future bride. I'm in love with you, too, John. Patience grabbed John's hands and squeezed them, enjoying their wonderful warmth and strength. I can't tell you what a relief that is to hear. I've been pacing back and forth at the mercantile all day today. My parents couldn't wait until I got out of the house, John confessed. Patience grinned as she thought about John nervously pacing at the mercantile. Then her expression faltered, and she looked away. What is it, Patience? John tilted his head, trying to figure out what was wrong. I'm sorry. It's nothing. Patience fixed her gaze on the floor. This was a happy day, and she should enjoy it. Patience, we shouldn't start our life together by keeping things from one another. What is it? John asked gently. Patience sighed. She felt guilty bringing it up, but she knew John was right. She couldn't hide things from her soon-to-be husband. I have always pictured my parents standing beside me, or at least near me at my wedding. I am so excited to marry you, but at the same time, it's bittersweet because I know my parents won't be there. John nodded thoughtfully. That's a good point. I know what you mean. I am sad that my mother won't be there. I am fortunate that I have Toria, of course, but it won't be the same. Yes, Patience agreed. She was glad that John hadn't accused her of being difficult but instead agreed with her feelings. She knew how lucky she was to have found a man like him. Do you think there's any chance your parents may change their mind about me? John asked hopefully. Patience shook her head sadly. Unfortunately, I feel their minds have already been made up. And since the stabbing that took place last week, my parents have gotten more and more overprotective of me. No, I don't see them changing their minds at the moment. I see. In that case, then, maybe we should make plans with Reverend Bing to marry quickly and quietly. Once we are married, your parents can't object, right? John explained his line of thinking to Patience. Patience nodded. Yes, that sounds good to me. The sooner I am Mrs. John Jackson, the better. I just thought of something. Will your parents be able to attend? John smiled at his soon-to-be wife. Yes, they both told me they would love to attend. My parents know what a wonderful young woman you are, and they are thrilled to have you join the family. Patience felt guilty that she couldn't say the same about her own family, but John was taking all of this in stride. Then I agree. We should get married as soon as possible. I was hoping you'd say that. I've spoken to Reverend Bing, and I think we can get married next Saturday evening. John told Patience, hoping she would like this plan. Patience felt a tingle of excitement spread through her body. Once she and John were married, they would be able to truly live as husband and wife. Although she was a little scared and unsure of what was ahead of her, she knew she wanted to take this next step, and John was the right man to take it with. Chapter 7. Did you order the flowers? Toria sampled the chocolate frosting she had made the evening before and shuddered. This wouldn't do. She got out another bowl and began to make the recipe again. Yes, I did, dear, Mortimer called out, already exasperated and sick of wedding planning. What about a new suit jacket for yourself? The one you keep wearing has holes in it. Toria called as she walked to the pantry to get more flour, one hand at the small of her back to help support the weight of the baby. Yes, Toria, Mortimer replied dutifully. Toria adjusted her apron and walked over to Mortimer, who was seated at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper. She kissed him. I'm sorry, I know I've been absorbed by planning this wedding. Yes, you have. And you've been so distracted, you've forgotten about another special date. Mortimer didn't like to complain, but he felt it was important to remind his wife of what she had forgotten. Toria frowned and thought about it. Suddenly, realization and guilt dawned on her. Your birthday. Oh, Mortimer, I'm so sorry. Mortimer leaned back in his chair. It's all right. I know you've had a lot on your mind. If Patience's parents were more involved in this whole thing, I don't think you would have had to do as much. I think you're right, Toria agreed. I don't mind doing the work, because it will ultimately benefit John, but it would be nice if there were others to share the work. We can't really do anything about that right now, though. Well, the wedding will be over in a few days, and then we can get back to our regular routine. Of course, my birthday will also be over in a few days. Mortimer pointed out. Toria ran her hand through her hair. I have an idea. This Friday, don't make any plans after work. Mortimer wrinkled his face. Toria, since when have I made plans after work? Toria laughed and kissed her husband again. You're right. Good point. Before John and Willie left that morning for their deliveries, Toria explained her plan to them. After we have closed the mercantile and made all the deliveries for the day, I have made a reservation for all of us at Graham's Grub. Mortimer doesn't know. It's a surprise. I've made arrangements so Lydia will make his favorite dinner and dessert. John hesitated. I know you think this is a good idea, but I have a feeling the Grahams' minds are already made up. I don't see how a dinner at their restaurant is going to change anything. You may be right, John, but I'm going to ask you to trust me on this one. Toria's eyes sparkled. She thought she would be able to help John and his soon-to-be in-laws get along better. If she couldn't, John and Patience may have some difficult times ahead of them. All week, as Patience and her parents prepared for Mortimer's surprise birthday dinner, Patience was secretly thinking about the wedding that would take place the following day. Reverend Bing had agreed to marry them on Saturday evening, and Toria was making all the arrangements for everything Patience could possibly need. Flowers, baked goods, suits, everything. The only thing Patience didn't have was a wedding dress. Toria had offered to make one for her, but with so little time, Patience didn't feel it was right to ask her future mother-in-law to work around the clock to finish it. She also didn't have enough time to order a dress from a catalog. Patience had always dreamed of wearing a wedding dress, but she had a nice white blouse she could wear instead. John and Patience continued to see each other nearly every day. Neither of them could wait for the upcoming wedding. Patience couldn't wait to truly become man and wife in every sense of the word, and she had a feeling John couldn't either. On Friday evening, Mortimer's birthday, Toria helped him lock up the building after work. I know you said I shouldn't make plans, but I thought we would stay in tonight. Where are we going? Mortimer asked, surprised. Toria smiled. I have a little surprise for you. We'll take the wagon. John and Willie were already at the restaurant, but John had left the delivery wagon so Toria and Mortimer could use it. Mortimer flicked the reins, and they set off for Graham's Grub. Many people milled about on the street outside the restaurant. In the days after the stabbing, business had slowed a little, but now the crowds had returned in greater number. After Mortimer parked the wagon, Toria led him by hand into the restaurant. At the entrance, Patience greeted them. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. I mean, Mortimer and Toria." Patience flushed, remembering that the Jacksons had asked her to call them by their first names. "Follow me right this way." Mortimer arched an eyebrow at Toria. "What have you got up your sleeve?" "Nothing," Toria replied with an innocent smile. Patience led the Jacksons to a small private room near the back of the restaurant. In the room, John, Willie, and Beatrice and Arthur Jameson, along with their small daughter, Sally, were waiting for them. Mortimer beamed with joy. "What are all of you doing here?" "We're here to celebrate your birthday, of course, dear." Toria took his arm and guided him to his seat at the head of the table. "Happy birthday." As the others gave Mortimer their well wishes, Toria excused herself. She had another motive for scheduling Mortimer's dinner at Graham's Grub, and she was about to act on it. She walked through to the main dining area of the restaurant, where she saw 3 familiar men drinking out of the same flask at a table. The men were laughing loudly and carrying on, despite the fact that there were families with small children around. Toria frowned at their antics, trying to place their faces. It came back to her with a jolt. These were the men who had carried on in the mercantile, trying to convince John to go drinking with them. She quickly passed by them, avoiding eye contact. She still believed these men were trouble and didn't want to get involved in any way. Toria saw Lydia Graham near the front of the restaurant. "Hello, Lydia," Toria said warmly. "I was wondering if I could have a word with you and your husband." Lydia looked puzzled. "Of course," she replied. She couldn't refuse the polite request of one of her customers. She gestured for Toria to follow her back into the kitchen. "Hello, Robert." "Good to see you both," Toria began. "I wanted to talk to you about a sensitive topic." Lydia and Robert were horrified. What was Toria about to say? Lydia's mind went to Patience first. Had the girl gotten in some type of trouble? And if she had, how was Toria the first to know? Toria saw the expression on their faces and fought off laughter. "Oh, it's nothing like that, I promise. I wanted to talk to you because I know my John has strong feelings for your daughter, Patience. My understanding is that you're both concerned that he has a reputation for drinking. I can assure you that I have not seen him take a drink in over 3 months. What's more than that, he's a good, decent, hard-working man." Toria continued. "I know you want what's best for your daughter. That's what we all want as parents. I just wanted to tell you that the John the First know is a wonderful young man who deserves a chance. I hope you'll give it to him." Toria finished her impassioned plea and took a deep breath. "I appreciate you taking the time to hear me out. I'm sure you will make the choice you feel is best for your daughter. I needed to defend my stepson, though, because I know rumors and gossip can be damaging to a young man." Lydia and Robert looked surprised, but not upset or angry. "We appreciate you coming to talk to us, Toria." "Thank you." Toria could tell that neither of them was going to say any more on the subject, so she thanked them again and excused herself. When she got back to the table, servers were pouring punch for everyone at the table, and the group had begun to order food. Patience took their orders, writing them down on a small pad of paper. Toria smiled and squeezed Mortimer's hand as she sat back down. "Are you all right, dear?" Mortimer whispered. "I'm just fine. Thank you for checking," Toria replied. Mortimer had a feeling his wife was up to something, but he decided to let it go and enjoy his birthday festivities instead. That was what marriage was all about sometimes. Deciding which things to fight over and which ones to let go. All in all, Mortimer was very lucky to have a woman as smart and hardworking as Toria by his side. Mortimer relaxed and watched his friends and family laugh and catch up. He wished that Patience didn't have to work that evening, but soon enough, she would be an official part of the family. He had never had a daughter before. He wasn't sure exactly how it would work, but he was sure that Toria would figure it all out and explain it to him. She was very good at that. "To my father," John shouted out of nowhere. "May you have many, many more birthday celebrations." Mortimer frowned. John's voice sounded a little odd and distorted in some way. Perhaps his hearing was going. That wasn't a good sign. Thank you, son. Beatrice and Toria were busy exchanging details about the baked goods they made and sold at the mercantile. They were constantly changing the numbers and types of their delicious baked goods so they could keep up with demand. The men of Creed adored their baked goods and often bought them just as quickly as they were offered. It looked like Arthur was talking to John, but John wasn't paying much attention. He stood up, walked to the head of the table, and threw his arms around his father. I love you, John said unsteadily. Mortimer frowned. He appreciated his son's sudden energy, but he didn't understand where it was coming from. His son was normally very reserved with his emotions. I love you, too, John, Mortimer said softly. He looked at Toria for support, but Toria hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. The servers came to refill everyone's punch glasses. I need more. John called, still standing at the head of the table. I need more. Mortimer looked at John's glass. It was still half full. Something wasn't adding up. Let's get you back to your seat, son. As Mortimer helped John back to his seat, John seemed to have trouble walking in a straight line. Mortimer waited until John was seated and then went back to his own chair. Mortimer shook his head. What in the world? Just then, Patience arrived with plates of food for the table. She began setting them down one by one in front of the guests. Lydia and Robert followed closely behind with even more plates. John leapt up from his chair once again. Mortimer winced. What was his son going to do now? John grabbed Patience's arm. This is the woman I love. I love this woman. Patience, you're the best woman I've ever met. Patience froze, mortified. She couldn't believe John was carrying on like this in front of her parents. He had been trying for so long to make a good impression, and now he was squandering all of the goodwill he'd built. Toria was finally paying attention, an alarmed look on her face. She sprang to her feet and walked over to John. Are you all right? Maybe you have a fever. As soon as Toria was right next to John, she knew immediately what the problem was. John was drunk. She didn't drink herself, but had previously worked for men who were big drinkers and could always identify what they were drinking based on how it smelled. Whatever John had had didn't smell, but his cheeks were red and his eyes seemed unfocused. Judging by what John's breath smelled like, he had been drinking moonshine. Toria felt like she had been kicked in the stomach. John had sworn to her that he was never going to drink again, and she had believed him. And now, here he was, carrying on and making a scene in front of his future wife and her parents, the very parents she had tried to convince earlier that night that he was as sober as a judge. John wasn't cooperating with Toria, so she placed a hand on his arm. I think we should take you home. You can finish celebrating with your father later, when you feel better. To her surprise, John swatted her hand away, accidentally knocking into Patience, who spilled the hot plate she was carrying all over the front of her dress. Patience yelped as the hot food splattered across her clothing. Lydia cried out and tried to help her daughter, but Robert just stood there. Do something, Robert. Lydia commanded. Robert walked up to John. You need to be more careful, son. You could have seriously hurt my daughter. John looked at Robert and drew himself up to his full height, so he was looking down at the older man. John had at least 2 inches on Robert. I would never hurt your daughter. I love your daughter. I'm marrying her tomorrow. John slurred his words and rocked from side to side, pounding his chest. Now Mortimer understood. His son was as drunk as he had ever seen a man. Mortimer was so embarrassed by his son's behavior that he wished he could sink into the floor and never be seen again. If Mortimer was embarrassed, Patience was humiliated. There was no way she could marry this man. He was a drunk who had spilled hot food all over her and then had not even helped her clean it up. She couldn't believe that he had broken his promise to her never to drink alcohol again. And in her parents' restaurant, no less. It was clear to her that John had a drinking problem that could not be fixed by a quick courtship and marriage. He had problems she would not be able to help with. Come here, my bride, John continued, reaching out for Patience. Patience steadied herself for what she was about to say. I'm not your bride, and I never will be, John Jackson. You brought shame to me and my family. I never want to see you again. Patience burst into tears and ran off, shocking every person in the room into silence. Lydia chased after her daughter and trailed her down the hallway. Patience went into the storeroom for lack of a better idea. She had no plan or agenda, she just knew she couldn't stand another minute in the room with John and all of the others. Lydia held the heavy storeroom door open after Patience had passed through it and followed her daughter into the dim room. Are you all right? What was that horrible man talking about? Patience could barely catch her breath. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Lydia walked over to her daughter and wrapped her arms around her. There, dear. It will be all right. Patience didn't think her mother was right about that, but she didn't feel like getting into an argument. She also didn't want to tell her mother about the plans she had made with John. She couldn't believe that she had actually been ready to marry the man. She felt horrible that she had believed all of his lies about being done with drinking. She had seen him drunk with her own two eyes, and she had hated every moment. The man she had watched throw food all over her in the restaurant was not the man she had fallen in love with. He was selfish, mean, and unaware of his surroundings. He had hurt her and embarrassed her, all at the same time. Patience pulled away from Lydia and looked down at her blouse. There were stains all over it. She began wailing again, and Lydia hugged her close. After a few minutes, Patience stepped out from Lydia's embrace and wiped her eyes. She took a deep breath. Thank you, Mother. I think I need to be alone now. Is that all right? Of course, dear. Don't worry about the restaurant, we will be fine without you for a few hours. I'll see you in the morning. Hopefully your father has already dealt with that awful man. Lydia shook her head. The nerve of John Jackson to come into her family's restaurant and behave in such a horrible way simply appalled her. And to think that he had tried to call her own daughter his bride. She hoped her husband had dismissed John once and for all. Meanwhile, Mortimer paid Robert Graham for the dinner and apologized profusely for his son's antics. Arthur and Beatrice looked on, embarrassed and sad for their friend. Beatrice comforted Sally, who had begun to cry, and Willie, who seemed scared and upset that his friend John was behaving so oddly. Toria and Mortimer dragged John into the family wagon. Toria didn't know if she would be able to speak, she was so angry. She was normally calm and collected, but she felt ashamed that she had stuck up for John to Patience's parents only to have him embarrass himself and his entire family in their restaurant. Toria's face burned with humiliation. Still, despite how mad she was, she worried about how John was. Mortimer was silent on the trip home. He was lost in his thoughts, thinking about where he'd gone wrong. He had truly believed John was on the right track. In the past few months, John looked better and was more pleasant to be around. This seemed completely out of character. How are you feeling? Toria whispered to John. A troubled feeling had begun to settle over John. Why are we going home? John felt confused and upset. Something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Mortimer and Toria looked at each other. Toria didn't know how to explain to John what had happened. She worried that her words would be too harsh. Mortimer took a deep breath. You had a few too many drinks, and I don't understand how because you seemed fine when we got to the restaurant, and you made a mess out of things with Patience. We had to leave to save you from further embarrassment in front of the Grahams. What? That can't be true. I haven't had a drop of alcohol in months. John protested. Now Toria grew even more concerned. Was there something seriously wrong with John? He was acting like he didn't remember anything. John, you spilled hot food all over Patience and called her your bride in front of her parents. She was so humiliated that she ran out of the room. Do you not recall any of this? John hung his head in shame. I do feel very strange. Like I used to feel when I went drinking in the past. But all I had to drink tonight was punch. He didn't understand. Mortimer frowned. His son had never lied to him before. Even when he was drinking, he was honest about where he had been and what he had been doing. He looked to Toria for help. "John, lying won't help you. You've made a mistake, and now you are going to face the consequences," Toria explained. She knew her husband didn't have the heart to be hard on his son, so she was going to have to do it. John shook his head. "That's the thing, though. I just don't remember." They pulled up to the house. Mortimer helped Toria out of the wagon, and John followed her into the mercantile's back entrance as Mortimer tied up the horses. They quietly walked up the stairs to the house. Toria poured a glass of water for John and handed it to him. "Well, maybe you'll remember in the morning. Tonight, you get a good night's rest." "I have a lot of apologizing to do tomorrow before the wedding," John said with a sigh. "John, Patience doesn't want to see you right now." "There is no wedding," Toria said gently. "What do you mean?" John's heart began pounding. "No, she can't just give up on me, just like that." "I'm sorry, John," Toria continued. "I think you need to respect Patience's wishes and give her some time to think. I don't think she wants to see you right now after what you did." John was too upset to respond. He put his hands to his head, trying to ease the pain he felt in his temples. He felt exactly like he did after an evening of heavy drinking, but how was that possible? There had to be some kind of explanation. He had heard of other men losing their memories after drinking, but that had never happened to him. He couldn't accept the idea that the love of his life had given up on him. There had to be something he could do to make her take him back. John went into his bedroom and shut the door behind him. Toria was right. He needed a good night's sleep. Maybe in the morning, things would make more sense. Chapter 8. Patience woke up on Saturday to the sun shining and birds chirping outside her window and felt a little rush of anticipation. It was Saturday, the day she had been waiting for. The day she was to marry. Suddenly, the events of the night before came rushing back to her. Patience felt a headache start to form in the middle of her forehead and a lump in the back of her throat. She would not be marrying John Jackson after all. Not that day, and not ever. She trusted that Toria Jackson would inform Reverend Byng, for as angry as she was with John and humiliated by the entire situation, she had confidence that Toria would do the right thing for everyone involved. It was one of the reasons she had been so excited to marry John, to join his family and have Toria as a mother-in-law. Thinking about all she'd lost sent Patience into a fresh wave of sobbing. Lydia knocked on the door. "May I come in, dear?" "Not now, Mother," Patience called. She didn't have the heart to face anyone just yet. "Just for a little?" Lydia persisted. Patience sighed. "Fine, Mother, but please make it quick." Lydia nudged the door open and sat down next to Patience on her bed. She wiped her daughter's tears away with her fingers. "Patience, if you keep crying like that, your skin is going to look quite wrinkly and unbecoming." Patience bristled. Her mother was not helping the situation. "I'd like to be alone now." "Patience, we gave you the evening off. We knew you were embarrassed by what happened, and that's understandable. But it's a new day, and you have chores to do," Lydia explained. She couldn't believe how upset her daughter was over Mortimer Jackson's son. She knew from Toria's strange speech that John had feelings for Patience, but it seemed unlikely that Patience also had feelings for John. He seemed nice enough in general, but he had a reputation for running with a bad crowd and drinking. After the previous evening's events, Lydia had seen enough, as far as she was concerned. "I need a little more time. I'll do my chores later." "I promise," Patience pleaded. Lydia sighed. "All right, Patience. As long as all your chores are done by noon, I don't really care if you stay in here and cry the rest of the day." Lydia stayed seated on the bed, wishing she could end her daughter's tears. It had been so much easier when Patience was a small girl. Lydia would be able to wipe away her tears and make everything better with a kiss or hug. Now, Patience's heartbreak was much bigger and much harder to fix. "Please, Mother," Patience begged. "Fine," Lydia said as she got up from the bed. "Remember what I said. Noon." Patience nodded dutifully and waited until her mother had closed the door. She slumped back down onto her bed and pulled the covers around her tightly. She didn't feel like doing anything. All she wanted to do was stay in her room alone so she would never have to face her parents, John Jackson, or anyone else in town for a long, long time. Just as Patience was drifting back into a peaceful sleep, there was another loud knock on her door. "Who is it?" Patience called out, annoyed. "It's me," Robert said from the other side of the door. "You have a visitor." "I tried to send him away, but he wouldn't take no for an answer." "Patience, do I need to get the marshal involved?" Patience's heart raced as she realized whom her father was talking about. She hastily pulled on her undergarments and a dress and laced her boots up. She opened the door to her bedroom and pushed past her father. Patience rushed down the stairs to the main entrance of the restaurant and found John Jackson standing at the door, looking pale and morose. His expression brightened as soon as he saw Patience. "Patience. I am so sorry about what happened last night." "I still don't know quite what happened." "That's because you were drunk," Patience snapped. "I know you must be angry," John tried to continue. "You're darn right I'm angry. And ashamed and humiliated and mad. I thought I knew what kind of man you were, John Jackson. But instead, you're just a drunk and a liar." John swallowed. He knew he'd messed up, but he had no idea Patience would be this worked up about it. "I'm going to do everything in my power to make it up to you. I'll prove that I'm worthy of you." "I don't think so, John. I told you last night I never wanted to see you again, but I guess you've forgotten that, too, on account of your drinking. To think that I almost got caught up in all of your lies." Patience shook her head sadly. "I haven't had a drink in months, Patience. You must believe me." Patience shook her head. John seemed like he believed his own lies, but she would not be fooled again. "Please, Patience," John begged. She needed to give him another chance. Patience slammed the door in his face. She slid down onto the floor, fighting back more tears. While she had been yelling at John, the tears had stayed away, but now that she was by herself, they threatened to downpour all over again. Lydia rushed over to her daughter. "I can't believe the nerve of that man. Your father said he might need to send for the marshal. Do you think we need to do that?" Patience shook her head and dabbed at her eyes. "No, I don't think that will be necessary." Lydia frowned. "Oh, Patience. Crying again? Remember what I told you about your face." "I remember, Mother," Patience yelled. Suddenly, everyone and everything was making her mad. "I suppose there's no point in putting anything off any further. I'll start my chores now." Patience stood up and went into the kitchen to begin her morning tasks. Although it was later than she normally completed them, she still had plenty of time before noon, when the restaurant opened for lunch. Patience began her tasks by sweeping the floors. She pushed it back and forth across the floor, trying to forget all about John Jackson and his broken promises. "Easy there, Patience," Robert said as he watched her attack the floors with the broom. He hoped John Jackson wouldn't dare to show his face at the restaurant again. If he showed up one more time to bother his daughter, Robert was going to have to take action. Once Patience was done sweeping, she went to retrieve the mop and a bucket from the storeroom. On her way there, she kept coming back to one of the things John had said. He had acted like he didn't know how he had ended up drunk and sworn that he hadn't had anything to drink in months. Was there any possible way that he could be telling the truth? "He is telling the truth, Patience," Sarah said, suddenly appearing right in front of Patience in the storeroom. Patience yelped in surprise. "Where did you come from?" "It's probably time I told you who I am, Patience," Sarah replied calmly, a serene smile on her face. "I'm your guardian angel, and I've been sent here to make sure you end up with your one true love." Patience was too shocked to speak. She had a dozen questions, but couldn't make her lips move to ask them. "I know you're feeling too surprised to talk, so I'll answer some of the questions that are on your mind." Sarah chuckled. "You're probably thinking I'm not doing a very good job, aren't you?" Patience nodded. How did Sarah know exactly what she had been thinking? I know you're upset with John right now, but you do need to forgive him, Patience. His behavior yesterday evening wasn't actually his fault, Sarah explained. Patience opened her mouth to protest, but the words still weren't coming to her. I know, you're thinking, how could that possibly be true? Sarah continued, it's not my job to explain exactly what happened. You and John will need to work a few things out on your own. But it is my responsibility to make sure that you two end up together. Patience couldn't believe what she was hearing. She felt torn. One part of her was thrilled that Sarah was telling her that she was meant to be with John Jackson. He was the first man she had ever truly cared about or wanted to become close to. Another part of her felt like she was in disbelief and upset. Who was this woman to tell her what to do? And how would she know what was and wasn't John's fault? It was all too much to take in. If you don't heed my advice, Sarah said, her tone turning dark, then your life is at risk. And if you die too soon, your future children will never be born at all. Sarah hung her head mournfully. What are you talking about? Patience finally found her words. You're not making any sense. I know my warnings might seem strange to you now, Patience, but it's my job to protect you. There are many things that I know about that you can't know, or at least, not yet, Sarah said. Patience was growing frustrated with Sarah's cryptic words. Why can't you just tell me what's going on? If my life is really in danger, shouldn't you tell me why it's in danger? Sarah considered this for a moment. Here's what I can say, there are evil forces at work in Creed. There are some dark days ahead, and not everyone will survive them. If you don't marry John, you won't be living with him, and therefore, he won't be able to protect you from the attack. Patience looked around, suddenly feeling fearful. Attack? Who's going to attack me? Sarah sighed. Oh, dear. I've probably said too much. What's important is that this can all be avoided, quite simply. Go to John. Allow him to apologize to you. Accept his proposal. You'll get to have the family you've always dreamed of. Patience narrowed her eyes. How do I know I can trust you? For all I know, you're one of John's friends, and are just saying all of these things to make me marry him. This might all be a big trick. Oh, dear. Sarah frowned. It seems I've really made a mess of things if you don't believe I am who I say I am. I don't know how to make you believe. You need to find it in your own heart to accept who I am. What I can tell you is this, I know you've noticed that I can appear and disappear whenever I need to. I usually talk to you when you're alone, so we have some privacy. A few days ago, I helped you and John find each other in the town square. I was the one who led John to your side when you met in the middle of Main Street a little while back. Do you remember that? Patience thought about this. Her head was spinning. She wanted to believe Sarah. She had a feeling deep down that Sarah was telling the truth, but she had also believed that John was telling the truth, and that had turned out horribly. I don't know. I also know what you're thinking. At any time, Sarah reminded her. Patience decided she would do a test. She would think of something that Sarah couldn't possibly know what she was thinking of. She tried to pick something that would be very hard to guess, like the yellow pincushion at the bottom of her mother's sewing basket. Yes, it's a lovely yellow pincushion. Shame your mother keeps it hidden away like that, Sarah said, not missing a beat. Patience gaped at Sarah. How did you know that? I told you, I know what you're thinking. We're connected, dear, Sarah replied. That's something even I don't know everything about. I couldn't explain it all even if I wanted to. And what's more, we have limited time together. So I hope I am able to impress upon you the importance of you marrying John. Patience nodded slowly. I think I finally understand what you're trying to tell me. But what can I do? My parents hate him, especially after he carried on like that in the restaurant. I know I was already planning to disobey them by marrying him, but now it just seems foolish to have a relationship with John Jackson. Why don't you go to him? Sarah suggested. Talk to him. Ask him to tell you everything about last night. Maybe the two of you together can figure out how to move forward. Sarah's eyes widened. I need to go now. I'm needed elsewhere. Please, think about what I've said. Your life truly will depend on it. In the blink of an eye, Sarah was gone. Patience looked all around the storeroom, but there was no trace of her. Sarah, being an angel, would explain all the weird appearances and disappearances, and her ability to read Patience's mind. Still, Patience felt skeptical. It all seemed like it could be one big, cruel joke someone was playing on her. Patience considered Sarah's suggestion to talk to John and ask him exactly what had happened the night before. That morning, she had been too angry to have a calm, reasonable discussion with him, but maybe Sarah was right. In any case, it couldn't hurt to have a more logical conversation, rather than tears, screaming, and door slams. Patience grabbed the mop and bucket and rushed back into the kitchen. She looked at the clock on the wall. She still had plenty of time before noon, but now, she had a new mission. Patience finished her chores as quickly as possible, scrubbing every last surface until it shined and gleamed. She raced up the stairs to her room. I'm done with chores. I'm going to read for a bit. Patience yelled down to her parents. All right, dear. No need to shout. Lydia replied from the bottom of the staircase. She shook her head. What had gotten into her daughter? 1 minute she was sobbing, the next she was scrubbing, and the next she was shouting from the stairs. Daughters were impossible sometimes. Patience waited until she heard her parents go into the dining area to prepare for lunch. She tiptoed carefully down the stairs and exited through the side door. She hoped that her parents would be so busy with lunch, they wouldn't even think to check on her. If they did find out she had left the house, she knew she'd be in trouble. Even though the missing girls had been found and other kidnapping attempts had been prevented, her parents insisted on accompanying her almost every single time she left the house. Patience shook her head. No, it was much easier to simply leave the house without asking for permission. The walk to the mercantile was a bit long. Her father or one of his employees usually drove when they needed to purchase something outside of the normal delivery, but walking in the fresh air allowed her to clear her mind and think. She still wasn't sure what she was going to do about John. She believed Sarah was telling the truth, and she was scared that her life would be in danger. She knew she wanted a husband and children, a family of her very own, but she still wasn't convinced that John was responsible enough to make that all possible. Still, she owed him a chance to explain himself. When Patience arrived at the mercantile, John was building a new set of shelves on the side of the store. Toria was at the front of the building, helping an older woman pick out fabrics. Patience approached John cautiously. When John saw Patience, his mouth broke out into a wide grin. Patience. I'm so glad to see you. Is there somewhere we could speak privately? Patience asked. John walked over to Toria and whispered a few words to her. Toria glanced at Patience, smiled, and nodded. John returned to Patience and gestured to the back of the store. Follow me. Patience trailed John through to the exit in the back of the store. John held the door open as she walked through into the glittering sunlight. I really am sorry about last night, Patience, John began earnestly. I want you to know that if you'll give me another chance, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Could you tell me a little more about what happened? I want to understand, Patience explained. John shook his head warily. I honestly wish I could explain it. There's a lot I don't understand. You can start by telling me everything you did yesterday, Patience suggested. Okay. Let me think, John said, stroking his chin. It was a full day of work, doing deliveries for the mercantile. Willie and I finished just a little early, so we would be back in enough time to go to my father's birthday dinner. We left the wagon at the store so Toria and my father could use it. Then we walked to the restaurant together and waited for the others to arrive. And that's where everything starts to get a little confusing. I don't remember everything, John admitted. You don't remember drinking any alcohol? Patience asked. No. I gave that up months ago, Patience, for you. John looked straight into Patience's eyes. He wanted so badly for her to believe him. And you didn't consciously make the choice to drink alcohol? Patience continued. Correct. I did not make the choice to drink alcohol. John sighed. I know it must sound ridiculous, but I am telling the truth. Thank you for telling me what you remember, Patience said. I honestly don't know what to do. I would love to give you another chance, but the truth is you hurt me badly yesterday, and I'm not sure I'm ready to do so. John exhaled loudly. I can understand that, Patience. I'll wait for you as long as it takes. Thank you for understanding. I should leave. My parents don't know I'm here, Patience said sheepishly. John walked with her to the front of the building. In the distance, he could see a group of men loudly laughing and talking, headed for the mercantile. I should get back to work. When can I see you again, Patience? I don't want last night to ruin everything. Patience felt conflicted. She wished she could tell John not to worry about it, but she wasn't able to forget the events of the night before so easily. I'm not sure, John. I just don't know. I understand. But I hope you'll change your mind. I'm going to do everything I can to make you see that last night's events are not a reflection of my character, John told her. Patience knew John was telling the truth. She nodded her head and turned to leave. Before she could walk away, John grabbed her hand. Patience turned around, startled. I love you, Patience Graham, John whispered tenderly. Patience felt little shivers running up and down her spine. No matter what John had done, he was also the only man she'd ever met who could make her feel like this. Patience withdrew her hand and turned back around, walking away as quickly as possible. Her strong feelings for John were making her decision even more complicated. She needed to go home and think for a while. There had to be a solution to her predicament. She just didn't yet know what it was. Chapter 9. Whistling and shouting, Grant, Riley, and Roger strode into the mercantile as Toria monitored their every move. She didn't trust these men and didn't want them anywhere near her or her family. Although they were customers, she didn't care for their business and wished she could refuse them in trance. But she and Mortimer both felt strongly that the mercantile should be available to all of Creed's residents, even if they didn't agree with all of the residents or their lifestyle choices. Toria sighed. Mortimer wasn't working, but she wished he were there to make sure the young men weren't up to too much trouble. Fortunately, John was there, and Toria knew the men wouldn't try anything violent in front of their old friend. Hi, John. Riley grumbled as the men began poking around each corner of the store. As Toria watched the men carefully, she found her thoughts drifting back to the previous evening's events. She was still in a bit of shock herself. In the span of one day, she had gone from planning a wedding to comforting her stepson because his beloved didn't want to see him again. She was glad Patience had come to speak to him at the mercantile. She thought that was a good sign. But Patience had left rather abruptly, and there had been no signs of reconciliation. Toria was upset for John and Patience, but she was also a little sad for herself, too. Patience was a wonderful young woman who would have made an excellent addition to Toria's small family. Although Toria loved Mortimer and John fiercely, she was more than ready for some female companionship. The one thing she still could not figure out was what had happened to John the night before. If she didn't know any better, she would have thought someone had slipped something into his drink. But that was impossible. John had drunk from the same punch that several other people at the table had enjoyed. Another possible culprit would be if John had eaten something that had made him feel strange, but that was impossible because they hadn't yet received their food when John began acting strangely. Toria remembered that when she had first met John, he drank often and couldn't be trusted or relied upon. If his strange outburst had happened then, she wouldn't have thought twice about it, but she knew that John had done a lot of hard work to give up drinking, gambling, and spending time with his friends who were poor influences on him. She believed him when he said he hadn't had a drink. So what in the world had happened the night before? How much for these, Toria? Grant sidled up to Toria and pressed a tin of sardines onto the counter. Toria stepped back. It's Mrs. Jackson, and let me check. Toria looked up the price in her book next to the register. Before she could read him the price, Toria remembered something. She had seen Grant and his two friends at the restaurant the night before. And they had been sharing a flask. I'll tell you the price if you tell me one thing. And you need to be honest with me. Do you agree? Grant smirked. All right, but I don't see why that's necessary. Did you have anything to do with John somehow getting drunk last night? Toria looked right into Grant's eyes and stared at him, waiting for him to answer her truthfully. Grant looked away. I don't need these sardines. I'm leaving. Roger, Riley, let's go. Roger and Riley were still looking at different items in the mercantile, and they didn't respond quickly. You agreed to tell me the truth. I just want to know what happened. You won't be in any trouble, Toria explained. Grant sighed. I got mad that John was ignoring all of his friends. It didn't seem right. I just wanted to make him see that he can't just forget about us. I just wanted to teach him a lesson. Grant sounded miserable. Toria almost felt sorry for him, but then she remembered his reprehensible actions. You'd better explain to me exactly what happened, Grant, Toria continued. What will happen if I don't? Grant asked sullenly. Toria thought for a moment. You and your family will never be able to purchase anything from this store again. She knew if she explained the situation to Mortimer, he would agree. Grant sighed. John came over to Toria and Grant, approaching them cautiously. He had heard his name and wanted to learn more. What are you talking about? John asked. Toria's eyes blazed as she gestured at Grant. Grant needs to explain himself, and he owes you an apology. John was confused. What had Grant done that he needed to explain himself for? Grant looked at the ground. Last night, the three of us were at Graham's Grub. We had a flask of moonshine with us as we ate our dinner, and we took turns drinking from it. We were all having a good time, and then we saw you all come in. Grant glared at John. We started thinking about how you've ignored us for the past few months, and how you act like you're better than us. I don't think I'm better than anyone, John interjected. I'm making choices that are right for me and my family. That shouldn't be any of your concern. Grant exhaled. He looked like he was in pain, but Toria stared at him expectantly, waiting for him to continue. At the time, it made us angry. So we found one of the Graham's Grub servers. We convinced him to pour a little moonshine into his pitcher of punch and only use that pitcher to fill your glass, not anyone else's. John's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Toria was angry. Who would agree to such a thing? I think the Grahams need to hear that story, so they can appropriately deal with their employee. Why, John could have been hurt or worse. Grant stared at the floor again. We offered him some money to do it for us. We thought it would be funny. Well, what you thought would be funny has cost my stepson a great deal. The woman he loves, Toria began, so upset that she barely was able to speak. I'm handling that, Toria. But this is helpful. I was wondering how it was that I came to be drunk last evening, John interrupted. He didn't see the value in continuing to berate Grant for his bad deed. What Grant and his friends had done was wrong, but it was over now, and from the look on the man's face, John had a feeling that he wouldn't pull a stunt like that again. That being said, I do suggest that the three of you leave. Right now. And that you don't come back for a very long time. I'm sorry, Grant said so quietly that John wasn't sure at first if he had heard correctly. Grant rushed over to Riley and Roger. In less than a minute, all three men had exited the mercantile. Toria breathed a sigh of relief. I'm glad they left. Something about them makes me very nervous whenever they are in this building. I know what you mean. Sometimes, I get a strange feeling about men like that. A sense of danger or something, John admitted. He felt foolish saying something like that out loud, but he knew that Toria wouldn't judge him for it. Are you all right? I'm so sorry, John. I owe you an apology, too. I should have believed you when you said you hadn't had anything to drink. You didn't realize that someone had slipped something into your drink. You were telling the truth, as far as you knew. Please forgive me, John smiled. You have nothing to apologize for. What you thought was completely reasonable after what happened and after my past. Of course I forgive you, But I don't think you really did anything that needed forgiveness. You're taking this so well, John. How are you going to tell Patience? Toria wondered. It wasn't right that the actions of a few bad men would completely destroy his plans to marry the love of his life. Patience had to know. I'm not sure, John admitted. I have a feeling she needs some time to be alone right now, with her thoughts. I don't want to crowd her or pressure her unnecessarily. Does that make sense? Toria thought about it. I think I understand what you're saying, but I think you should tell her right away what happened. Otherwise, she's going to continue thinking that you made a poor decision, and that's not true. Well, I did explain to her everything I remember. I think she trusted me when I said I didn't remember having anything to drink, John pointed out. Toria sighed. I'm probably getting too involved. I'm sure you know what's right for you and Patience. I'd just hate to see her slip away because of a few corrupt men's terrible actions. John smiled at his stepmother. I know you are just looking out for me, Toria. I appreciate it. I'll think about what you've said. Now, I'd better get back to these shelves. Toria nodded as John returned to his work. She was still stewing from Grant's confession about having the server put alcohol in John's drink. In fact, she had half a mind to go down to Graham's Grub immediately to tell Robert Graham that one of his servers had accepted a bribe to intentionally hurt a customer. Most of all, she wanted the entire Graham family to know that John had been set up to get drunk. That he wasn't a drunk or a liar himself. Toria took a deep breath and reminded herself that she shouldn't continually meddle in John's business. He was a grown man and could take care of himself. As much as she loved her small family, sometimes she wished that John had been younger when she'd married Mortimer. There were certain things that she'd missed out on because her stepson was already fully grown when they'd met. Some days, she longed for the simple pleasures of having a younger child, reading to a small boy, dressing a little girl in ribbons, or a simple stroll down Main Street with an infant seemed like such a sweet activity. But Toria put that thought out of her mind. Soon her child would be there, and she could do all that with him or her. She would just have a different kind of relationship with John. Toria and John worked for the rest of the day in a companionable silence. John finished the shelves he was building, and Toria admired his handiwork. Although it was closing time, she couldn't wait to put the china on the new shelves. She knew exactly how she wanted to arrange it. I'm going upstairs. Do you want me to lock up? John asked. No, I can do that. Thank you, John. I'll see you later, Toria replied. John shrugged. He loved his stepmother, but she truly loved to work. He and his father worried that she might wear herself out one day. In the meantime, though, she was a wonderful employee at the Mercantile, keeping everything running smoothly and efficiently. Mortimer and John only had to focus on their own jobs without worrying about anything else. It was a wonderful change after several years of worrying about the accounting and inventory. John went upstairs and tried to decide what to do for the evening. Whatever he ended up doing, it would be a far cry from what he had planned to do. He thought wistfully of his dream for a simple wedding in front of Reverend Byng, with Patience staring lovingly into his eyes and his father and Toria looking on. Just thinking about it made his heart ache. He wondered what his former bride-to-be was doing at that exact moment. He pictured her soft, silky hair and delicate lips. Oh, how he wished that he could run a hand through her hair or press his lips up against her own. Heck, he'd settle for simply holding her hand. It was strange. In the past, if John had found out that someone had put something in his drink, he would have wanted to hit the man or commit some other type of violent act against him. But when Grant had admitted that he had arranged for moonshine to be poured in John's drink, all John had felt was relief. He had known he hadn't broken his promise to himself, his family, and Patience, but it was a major comfort to have it confirmed by another person. Instead of anger or retaliation, all John felt was pity for Grant and his friends. He was sad for anyone who thought it was okay to do that to another person. If that was how they had chosen to spend their time, they had a lot more problems than John did. As he considered what to do that evening, he couldn't stop thinking about Patience. He grew sadder and sadder when he thought about her marrying another man one day. He didn't think he could stand it if he saw them arriving at church together or pushing a baby carriage down Main Street. He knew in his heart that Patience belonged to him, but how could he make her see that? John decided he needed to take a walk and get some fresh air. There was no use in stewing silently in his bedroom all evening. He walked without a particular destination in mind, stretching his legs and trying to clear his mind. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, and he just wanted to relax. John was surprised when he found himself outside of Graham's Grub. The restaurant was open for dinner, and a steady number of people were entering and exiting. John debated whether or not he should try to explain to Patience or her family what had happened. He paced back and forth on the street, wondering if he should go into the restaurant. Finally, John decided he had to try. He opened the front door of the restaurant and walked in. He planned to explain to the staff at the front of the house that he needed to speak with Patience privately, but before he could say a word, Robert Graham was barreling toward him. Out! Robert thrust a finger at the door, his face red and furious. And don't come back. You're not welcome here. He had seen how upset John had made his daughter the evening before and that very morning. He couldn't believe the man had the nerve to show up yet again. Well, Robert was ready this time. He wasn't going to let this man hurt his little girl any more than he already had. John stumbled backward, then turned around and raced out the door. He felt even more embarrassed and ashamed now. He knew he had made a fool of himself the night before, but the fact that Robert hadn't even allowed him to speak a single word was far worse than he had expected. John walked through Creed, staring down at the ground, humiliated and hoping no one else knew about what had happened. Word did tend to travel quickly in Creed, though, so there was no telling who knew about his antics the night before or Robert's fury that evening. Robert had said John wasn't welcome there. He wondered if the Grahams would still allow him to make deliveries or if they would insist that Willie be the only one who delivered packages to the restaurant. He considered the possibility of never being able to see Patience again, and his heart throbbed with pain. A life without Patience was not a life he wanted to have. John paused outside of one of the taverns he used to frequent. The pain and humiliation he was feeling were unbearable. 1 drink would take the edge off. 2 to change the feelings, make them less hurtful. 3 to forget about his troubles completely. Watch it, a man in grimy work clothes called as he shoved John aside and headed into the tavern. John followed the man inside the pub. Dozens of men crowded around tables and a long bar, drinking from mugs, talking loudly, and laughing. John missed the easy camaraderie the men had. He felt like not drinking made him an outsider in this crowd. A little voice in the back of John's head pointed out that being an outsider in this crowd of derelicts and corrupt men was actually a good thing. I don't want to be like them, John thought, but another voice in his head was whispering how nice it might feel to take just 1 sip of a drink. John craved the burn of whiskey against the back of his throat. Just 1 drink couldn't hurt, could it? After all, anyone who had been in the restaurant the night before already thought he was a drunk. He would only be doing what they already believed to be true. Plus, he could stop whenever he wanted. 1 drink wouldn't make a difference. As John prepared to order, a sudden realization came over him. He hadn't given up drinking for Patience. He had done that on his own, for himself and his health. Sure, Patience had been a motivating factor, but she wasn't the end-all, be-all that convinced him to stop. John decided to leave the bar without ordering. As he left, Grant waved to him and rushed over. John, what are you doing here? I'm sorry, that's none of my business. I wanted to really apologize to you. I understand that you've made your decision and you don't want to drink. Friends? Grant offered his hand to John. Friends, John agreed, shaking his hand. I was actually just leaving. Meanwhile, at Graham's Grub, Patience was struggling. Sarah had told her to give John a chance to explain himself, and she had, but she still had no answers. She went back and forth on whether or not she should listen to Sarah and marry John, despite his behavior the night before. She wished Sarah would appear to her to help her make her decision, but Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Patience didn't have to work that evening because her parents gave her a few evenings off per month, and tonight was one of them. That was why it had been a perfect occasion for the secret wedding she and John had planned. When she thought of it, it made her want to cry. She had been so happy and excited to become Mrs. John Jackson in a few short hours. Now she didn't know if that would ever happen. Patience walked through the restaurant, checking in on customers and making sure they had everything they needed. Even though she didn't technically need to work, she enjoyed helping out, and her parents didn't mind since the restaurant was crowded and busy. All of the customers seemed to be content, so Patience decided to pay a visit to the kitchen. As she entered the room, she overheard a man calling for her father. "Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham. I need to speak to you," Jonah Briggs called urgently. Robert sighed. "Come in, Jonah." Robert was in the middle of making notations in his accounting ledger, and everyone knew that he hated to be interrupted. Patience was curious, so she moved to a dark corner of the kitchen where she could hear what the two men were saying. Jonah looked down at the floor. "I have something to tell you. I'm very sorry," he began, muttering his words. "Speak up, son." "I can't hear you," Robert complained. Jonah looked Robert in the eye. "I did something very wrong, sir. I know it was wrong now. I would understand if you have to dismiss me." Robert frowned. "What are you talking about, Briggs? Out with it." "Last night, these men, they offered to pay me money to pour from a flask into one man's punch," Jonah began. "They wanted to make him drunk. He drank it, and it made him sick. He behaved badly to you and to your daughter." "I'm so sorry." Robert's mouth fell open, and so did Patience's mouth as she watched this unfold. "Why am I just hearing about this now?" Robert asked. Jonah looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "I'm sorry, sir. I was ashamed of what I did. I'll return the money. I made a mistake." "That's right, you did. You also did the right thing by coming forward and telling me. But I still have to dismiss you. I can't have people in my employ who would do such a terrible thing to one of our customers." "You're dismissed," Robert said sadly. Jonah was a good employee, and he was sure he'd had reasons for what he had done, but there were some lines you just did not cross. Patience held her breath in the corner. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her heart wanted to sing and dance. John had been telling the truth all along. Patience slipped out of the kitchen and into the corridor. She walked toward the storeroom, hoping she could get away from the crowds and sit and think for a while. Before she got there, Sarah appeared right in front of her. "Oh, now you're here." Patience grumbled. "Before, when I needed you, you were nowhere to be found." Sarah smiled calmly. "You didn't actually need me then, Patience. I knew you'd figure it out on your own." Her tone turned serious. "But now, you do need to listen to me. John is at the corner tavern. You need to go to him and let him know that you found out the truth." "Wait a minute. He's in a tavern? I thought he was telling me the truth, that he had given up drinking." Patience wailed, more confused than ever. He was telling the truth. A few of his old friends were upset that he didn't drink with them anymore. They arranged for Jonah to put alcohol in his punch, but no one else's. That's why he got drunk yesterday and made a fool of himself and embarrassed you. But now. Again, Sarah's expression was serious. Now he's experiencing a crisis of conscience. He doesn't want to drink, but he also thinks he has nothing left to fight for. It's a dangerous predicament. You must go to him." With that, Sarah disappeared, leaving Patience all alone to ponder her message. In less than a minute, Patience had made her decision. If John truly was deciding whether or not to drink, Patience owed it to him as a friend to stop him. She continued down the corridor and pushed through the side door. Patience practically ran the entire way to the corner tavern. When she got there, she realized that it would be strange for her to go in all alone, an unmarried woman. She racked her brain, trying to come up with a solution. Before she could think of one, John came rushing out of the bar. He tripped and blinked, not expecting to find Patience before him. "John. Are you all right? Have you been drinking?" Patience asked, her beautiful eyes filling with concern. John smiled. "No, I haven't. I realized that I don't need to drink. I never have needed it. I just thought that I did." "That was a wrong assumption. Just like you all had a wrong assumption about my behavior last night." "Oh, John, I know. I'm so sorry I doubted you. Can you forgive me?" Patience asked. John frowned. "Wait a minute. How did you know I was telling the truth?" "One of my father's employees, Jonah, admitted that some men paid him to put alcohol in your drink. My father dismissed him, so you don't have to worry about that anymore," Patience explained in a rush. She hoped John would be able to see past her angry behavior over the past day. John grinned. "Patience, I'm not happy to hear that someone has lost his job, but aside from that, you telling me that makes me the happiest man in Creed. Or all of Colorado. Or all of the world." John picked Patience up and spun her around. Patience giggled and looked around, worried of what other people might think of them, carrying on like that in the streets. John bent down on one knee. "Patience Graham, I've asked before, and I'll ask again until you give me the answer I'm looking for. Will you marry me?" "Yes, John. Yes." Patience exclaimed happily. She looked down at her future husband. She knew she was the luckiest woman in the world. Chapter 10. 3 weeks later, John and Patience stood at the front of Reverend Bing's church in front of a small crowd of well-wishers. Toria wiped her eyes with a handkerchief as Mortimer stood by proudly. Beatrice, Arthur, and Sally sat toward the back of the church with Reverend Bing's sister, Millie, in case the toddler began to fuss and needed to be taken outside. Willie was there with his mother in his finest suit, beaming happily at his boss. And best of all, Lydia and Robert Graham blinked back tears from the front row. Patience still couldn't believe how quickly they'd changed their mind about John once they had heard the truth about what had happened. Since then, they had been nothing but warm and welcoming to their soon-to-be son-in-law. Everything had come together perfectly. Toria had already had most of the preparations ready from the first time they had tried to get married, with one special addition. As a surprise to Patience, Toria had ordered yards and yards of lace fabric and worked with Beatrice to create a stunning wedding gown. Together, they created a lovely, flowing masterpiece. On Patience, the dress made her look like royalty, and she felt incredible in it. John couldn't stop staring at his bride. Not only was she breathtakingly beautiful, but more importantly, she was kind, honest, and generous. He couldn't believe how lucky he was to be able to end up with a woman like her. Patience also couldn't believe her luck. John was a good man, and he came from a good family. She was not only gaining a husband, but a second set of parents in Toria and Mortimer. She and John had already gone through some difficult times, and she knew that they would be able to face anything that would be put in their way in the future. Reverend Bing gave a speech about how happy he was that Patience and John had found each other and about how the church would help them in the years ahead, individually and as a couple. Patience waited impatiently for Reverend Bing to get to the end of the ceremony. Normally, she loved his speeches and sermons in church, but today, she was waiting for something new for a change. Finally, Reverend Bing declared, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may now kiss the bride." In front of the small assembled crowd, John Jackson tipped Patience Graham's head back, pressed his lips to hers, and gave her the sweetest kiss she could have ever imagined. Patience kissed John back with passion until she heard Reverend Bing cough discreetly, certainly a signal that they should end their embrace. John and Patience instead turned to the congregation, smiling and laughing. Patience was so glad that they had made it to this day. When she had first started spending more time with John, she hadn't been sure if marriage was the right next step for the pair. Now, she couldn't imagine her life any other way. After the ceremony, the group adjourned to Graham's Grub for food and dancing. The Grahams had posted a large sign on the door letting people know that they were closed for the evening. Inside, Lydia and Toria had placed dozens of candles and red roses in vases on each table, and the tables themselves had been arranged in a large circle. One of Mortimer's friends sat down at the piano in the corner of the room and began playing one of Patience's favorite songs. Together, she and John danced to the music and stared into one another's eyes. From one of the tables, Toria watched the newlyweds, her eyes shining with fresh tears. She was thrilled for her stepson and his new bride. "Are you all right, dear?" Mortimer asked gently. "Yes," Toria replied. "I'm so happy for John and Patience." She squeezed her husband's hand. Meanwhile, Arthur and Beatrice looked at their daughter, Sally, as Patience and John danced. "Being here with you and Sally, my heart is so full, Arthur," Beatrice exclaimed. "I just know that one day, Sally will be the one getting married. I know we have a long way to go before that point, and I want to enjoy every moment of it, but think of how nice that will feel for our family to grow and change." Arthur smiled and put an arm around his wife's shoulder. She looked like an angel holding baby Sally. Although the young girl had been set on their doorstep without any explanation or information, Beatrice and Arthur had taken her in and raised her as their own. Now, Arthur couldn't imagine his life without either one of them. He thanked God for allowing Beatrice and Sally to come into his life, and he couldn't wait until the baby Beatrice carried was born. The Reverend Callum Byng eagerly ate the cake Toria had carefully baked. Each bite was more delicious than the last. The cake was rich and buttery, and the frosting had the exact right amount of sweetness. "Don't eat so fast, you'll get a stomachache," Callum's sister, Millie, scolded. "You haven't tried this cake yet, Millie." "I don't think anyone could eat this cake slowly," Callum replied. Millie took a bite of her own cake, which she had been saving for later, still full from the dinner Robert and Lydia had served. "Oh, my," Millie said as she chewed each delicious bite. "This is incredible." On the dance floor, John leaned in for a kiss. Patience kissed him back, surprised at how natural it felt to be in his embrace. She was still a bit apprehensive of the other activity married men and women were able to do, but she trusted John, and she knew that he would make sure she was comfortable. Even though she was nervous, she was also excited about it. She wanted to demonstrate to John that she was his wife in every sense of the word. Patience excused herself to go to the powder room. She had perspired a bit from the dancing and wanted to pat down her face and cool off. When she stepped into the room and looked in the mirror, she was shocked to find not only herself in the mirror, but Sarah's reflection staring back at her. Patience whirled around and stared at Sarah. "What are you doing here?" "I did what you asked." "Yes, and I'm very glad that you made the right choice," Sarah said. "This is our last visit together." "It is?" Although Patience had sometimes been annoyed by Sarah, she had grown accustomed to her visits and actually found herself liking the woman's personality. "That's how guardian angels work. We are here for you when you need us, but once you don't need us any longer, we must move on to the next person who needs our help," Sarah explained. Patience nodded. "I think I understand. So does that mean I don't need help anymore?" "That's right. You just married the love of your life, and soon, you two will start a family." "Now," Sarah began. "How do you know that? When? Will our first be a boy or a girl?" Patience asked her questions in rapid succession. Sarah shook her head, smiling mysteriously. "I'm afraid I can't tell you all those details just now. They'll come to you when you need them most." Patience sighed. Sarah was still being cryptic as always. "Will John and I be happy?" "Oh, yes," Sarah nodded. "That, you can be sure of. You two will be very happy together for many years to come." Patience smiled happily. Hearing that from her guardian angel was certainly reassuring. "Thank you for all that you've done to bring John and me together. I know I probably wasn't the easiest person to be the guardian angel for, but I'm glad you kept at it until I changed my mind." "You were perfectly fine, dear," Sarah said. "Now, there is something else I need to tell you." She looked off into the distance, her eyes clouding over. "What is it?" Patience felt nervous. She had felt so exuberant during the wedding and dancing with her new husband. Why did she feel like Sarah was about to give her awful news? Sarah turned her gaze back to Patience. "By marrying John, you have avoided a very bad event that could have happened to you. I'm so glad you chose John and married him as quickly possible. But Patience felt her heart sink. What was Sarah about to say? Trouble is coming to Creed, Patience. A very bad sort of trouble, the kind even I likely can't protect against. There are some things we can do to try to prepare you, and some precautions you can take, but most of all, you and John will need to do everything in your power to keep your family safe from harm, Sarah said, her words taking on an ominous tone. When is this trouble coming? Patience asked. She knew she should be scared, but it was hard to be frightened of something so vague. That's the thing. We don't know, Sarah admitted. Then how do you know anything bad will happen? Patience was so confused. She wanted to get back to dancing and eating cake with her new husband. Sarah sighed. Patience, Creed has turned into a very dark place. Many people come here for less than honest reasons, and they make poor choices here. Whenever a place like that exists in this world, it's only a matter of time before the darkness creeps in. Patience frowned. She still didn't understand how this related to her and her coming family. I need to go, Patience. But I wanted to warn you about the darkness that's coming. Just remember to always do what is right and what is kind, Sarah reminded. Goodbye, Patience. Patience threw her arms around Sarah to hug her in farewell, but she ended up wrapping her arms around herself instead. Sarah was gone. Patience laughed to herself. Maybe Sarah was being a little overprotective, like her parents. Then again, everything else Sarah had said so far had turned out to be true. In either case, Patience wanted to return to her husband. She practically skipped down the hallway into the dining area. She found John sitting at a table next to his parents. Patience joined them, and John kissed her as soon as she sat down. Congratulations again, Patience, Toria said, squeezing Patience's hand. You look beautiful. Thank you, Toria, for this incredible dress. I feel wonderful in it, Patience replied. It was all Beatrice, Toria said modestly. The dress had been a gift of love, happily given to her new daughter-in-law and sewn with love. Welcome to the family, Patience. Mortimer smiled. He was excited to have a new daughter-in-law. When his first wife had died, he had worried about John's ability to get married one day. He was worried that the pain of losing his mother might harden John from other relationships. Instead, and likely due to Toria's patience and kindness, John was now able to open up and have meaningful relationships with others. Thank you, Mortimer. Patience smiled. She could see where John had gotten his streak of kindness and generosity from. At first, she had thought Toria was a little young for Mortimer, but now that she knew them both a little better, she could see that they were a perfect fit for one another. You can call me father, if you'd like, Mortimer said with a big grin. I won't tell Robert. Patience threw her head back and laughed. That might take me a little getting used to, but I'll keep it in mind. Patience loved how this family could joke and chuckle with each other for hours. It was a difference from her own family, where things were usually quieter and more serious. Just then, Robert and Lydia approached the table and checked to see if anyone needed more cake, punch, or water. I'm stuffed, Patience protested, and Toria agreed. We're so proud of you, darling, Lydia said to Patience as she looked down at her daughter, sitting at the table with her new husband. Glad to have you in the family, son, Robert said, extending a hand to John. John accepted and shook Robert's hand, smiling up at the man. Just 3 weeks before, John had thought this day would never come. Now that it was here, he knew it was a day he would remember for the rest of his life. Epilogue. Toria Jackson removed a batch of cookies from the oven and set them down to cool off on the counter. The rich aroma of chocolate filled the air. Those smell so delicious, Patience called from the living area. She had propped up her heels on a small footstool and massaged her round belly. You're such a good baker, Toria. We need to wait a little while until they cool off, Toria said as she came back into the living room. I'll bring you one when they're ready. Toria, you need to rest. Mortimer scolded as Toria walked over to the crib and held up their baby boy, who had just woken up from a nap. He blinked his eyes a few times, and Toria kissed his forehead. "You're on your feet all day and night these days." Mortimer turned to Patience. "My wife never stops." "I feel fine, Mortimer," Toria grinned. "If I rest all the time, how will our baby ever learn the value of hard work?" "I always thought teaching children the value of hard work came after they were at least a few years old," John teased his stepmother. "I say it's never too early to start," Toria responded. She couldn't help but stay busy. With an infant of her own and a daughter-in-law who was pregnant, there was always work to be done. "Let me get the cookies once they're cooled off," Mortimer said. Toria sighed. "Fine. That will give me more time to catch up with Patience." "How are you feeling?" "Mostly fine. Sometimes I'll have strange cravings for an odd food. John has been very good about fixing me a snack in the middle of the night, at times." Patience chuckled. She rested a hand on her curved stomach. Being pregnant was a very strange adventure, but she was thrilled to be going on the journey with John. He was a wonderful husband and would make a terrific father to this child and the others she hoped would follow. Mortimer couldn't believe his luck. Although he hadn't been sure that he wanted more children when he'd married Toria, he'd known that they were important to her. He knew she would have sacrificed her dream to make him happy, but the more he had grown to love her, the more he had wanted to share her gifts and form a more permanent bond as husband and wife. When their son had been born, Mortimer suddenly realized how important having a child together was for a marriage. It had brought them together in ways he hadn't been able to imagine. Dr. Thomas believed Patience's child would arrive in just a few short months. John would soon have a baby of his own in addition to his new brother. Toria cradled her son close to her chest. She felt alive in ways she hadn't felt in years, since she was a small child. Mortimer was truly the man of her dreams, and now he had given her the family she had always wished for. Even better, she would be able to share her experiences in motherhood with Patience. Toria and Patience grew closer by the day. The pair had continued to make small and continuous improvements to the mercantile. The building was sparkling and looked nearly brand new, and the products were carefully arranged to allow customers to shop more efficiently and buy more in each trip. John Jackson sighed as he looked at his lovely wife. She was more than he had ever hoped for in a partner. He couldn't wait to meet their future son or daughter. He knew that by having Patience as a mother, the baby would turn out wonderfully. Patience smiled back at her husband, taking his hand and placing it on her belly. She had thought she would be annoyed by the swelling and weight gain that accompanied pregnancy, but instead, she felt fantastic, better than she had in years. She could scarcely believe her good fortune in meeting John and being welcomed into his supportive, generous family. Their unborn child would be cared for and loved in ways she could barely imagine. As Patience looked out the window, she saw the first few flutters of an imminent snowfall. The tiny flakes cascaded down onto the city of Creed, and Patience felt grateful for everything she had. Although she didn't know exactly what the future had in store for her, she knew that everything would turn out just as it was meant to be.